It was on one of those Sunday rides that I saw how easily Elvis could shift from daredevil to seeker. 7 or 8 of us, including Priscilla on the back of Elvis's Harley, were thundering back up Sunset Boulevard off of the PCH. Elvis was in the lead, and it seemed like some estate or building caught his eye. He pulled off Sunset through the open gates of an entryway, and we all followed. We pulled up alongside him, read a few of the posted signs around us, and realized we were on the grounds of the Self-Realization Fellowship. Elvis had intently studied Autobiography of a Yogi, the principal work of the movement's founder, Paramahansa Yogananda. From what I had learned from Elvis in many of our late-night conversations, part of Yogananda's focus was to understand that there was something miraculous in the simplest of natural everyday occurrences, and he encouraged those simple joys to be meditated upon. Some of the SRF teachings were on the proper way to breathe, the proper state of mind with which to go to sleep, the proper way to wake up and start the day. The notion of being deeply connected with your inner self, of simply being comfortable in your own skin, and of being able to live in the moment, had tremendous appeal to Elvis. It might seem strange that a guy who would insist that a dozen new motorcycles be delivered to his house at midnight was in search of a simpler life, but I think that's the point. Elvis knew better than anybody that the money and the expensive toys were not going to lead him to any sense of deeper purpose. We got off our bikes that day and began to stroll through the grounds of the fellowship, a beautiful spread of winding paths, ponds, gardens, waterfalls, and meditation chapels. Maybe some of the guys were more skeptical about the benefits of the self-realization philosophy, but I don't think anybody failed to feel what I felt that day. The place had a magic. You couldn't walk through there without feeling yourself calm down and open up. I could see the subtle change the place had on Elvis as we strolled along. He seemed to let himself relax and let his defenses drop. At the same time, he did not exactly slip into meditation mode. After a while, I could see a kind of antsy energy get the better of him. If a taste of tranquility was this good, then Elvis wanted access to the fellowship's deepest secrets of the soul as quickly as possible. He had a long talk with Brother Adolf, one of the fellowship members on the grounds, and a guy who seemed to take in remarkably casual stride the fact that Elvis Presley had dropped in. Elvis learned that the leader of the movement was now a woman named Dayamata, who had been personally tutored for the position by Yogananda. Dayamata stayed at a separate, private retreat up on Mount Washington, east of Hollywood. In the weeks that followed, Elvis got permission to visit Dayamata, and many times I accompanied him up to her home, a place that had the feel of a wealthy estate, religious shrine, and working farm all at once. Again, whatever quibbles one might have had with the SRF philosophy, the Dayamata was prime evidence that the practices worked. She was so calm and centered, so at peace with herself, that she absolutely radiated a feeling of maternal goodwill and gentle understanding. She was wise enough to know that Elvis couldn't just jump into the fellowship the way he wanted to. The secrets of the soul couldn't be delivered in crates like so many motorcycles. But she was wonderfully gracious to him and truly appreciative of his search for something of substance. They developed a great friendship, and every time we drove away from that Mount Washington retreat, usually with baskets of homegrown fruits in our laps, I could sense that Elvis had gotten some small piece of the peace he was after. In late spring of 1965, Elvis began work on the film Frankie and Johnny, and I found myself with a new Elvis-related job, on-screen talent. Elvis liked to include his friends in the films. Red or Sonny West turned up regularly in fight scenes. Joe had some speaking parts from time to time, and you could usually spot Alan, Richard, and Billy in the background of crowd scenes. I had started to do some stand-in and photo double work for Elvis, and on this film I got my first non-speaking bit part in front of the cameras. It was customary for me to ride to the studio with Elvis, but on one particular day, my scene was going to shoot before his, so I took off early for the Samuel Goldwyn Studios on my Bonneville. It was a wet, misty morning, and I couldn't wait to get to the coffee station on the sound stage. Coming through a bend in Sunset, I had the right of way, but apparently a woman in a car coming toward me didn't see me. She started a left turn that cut me off. I tried to lay the bike down, but I hit the side of her car, flipped over it, flew through the air, and landed on my back. As usual, I wasn't wearing a helmet, so I'm lucky that collision wasn't the end of me. I felt paralyzed for a moment, then started crawling down the street in a daze. Some other bikers just happened to see the accident happen and got me off the road, wrapped me in a blanket, and called for an ambulance. I spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, and though nothing was broken, I had extensive internal injuries. My back and chest were so sore that every breath was painful. A top gossip columnist in one of the papers managed to be inaccurate and insensitive at the same time, writing that one of Elvis's buddies had a motorcycle accident and broke his pelvis. Good thing it wasn't Elvis. I saved the clip for years because it was the first time he and I were mentioned together in a newspaper. Joe Esposito and Billy Smith and Richard Davis came to visit me, and I even got a surprise visit from Elvis's Frankie and Johnny co-star, Donna Douglas, a fellow self-realization advocate, best known as Ellie Mae from the Beverly Hillbillies. She cried when she saw the shape I was in and sat with me quietly for a long time, holding my hand. She left me with a reading light as a gift. One strange benefit of my hospital stay was that it may have kept me out of Vietnam. I'd gotten my draft notice a month earlier and had taken a physical in which it was decided that my football-injured back required a follow-up physical. The date for that follow-up fell during the time I was laid up recovering from the accident, and after the draft board was informed of what had happened to me and the extent of my injuries, I didn't receive any further notices. If I had, I would have gone. Not happily, but I don't think I would have felt I had any choice but to serve. When I finally did get back to the Perugia house, all I wanted was to be left alone. I had healed up enough to get around, but I was in a tremendous amount of pain and wasn't really sure if I'd ever be completely able-bodied again. I think most people hit some point in their early adulthood where they suddenly realize that maybe they're not indestructible. This was that point for me. The constant pain had me frustrated, and the frustration led to depression. As I hobbled into the house, I was perspiring and wincing in pain, and despite the fact that I could tell that Elvis was glad to see me, I was hurting enough that I had no desire to talk to him. I just hobbled to my room and lay down on my bed, gritting my teeth and waiting for the throbbing in my back to subside. A little while later, there was a soft knock at the door, and Elvis stepped into the room. "The boys were worried about you, Jerry. They told me how banged up you were." "Yeah, I still don't feel so hot," I said, hoping he wasn't planning on a long talk. "You know, I've been reading something on the power of touch," he said. "Healing power of the hands. Get over on your stomach for a minute." I have to admit it flashed through my mind, "Please, Elvis, let's not get into some crazy philosophy thing right now." But at the same time, I was desperate for relief, and it was nice to have him in the room. I rolled over and got as comfortable as I could. Elvis lowered his voice and talked, calmly and slowly, about the idea that each human body had an energy, and through touch those energies could connect. "Sounds a little half-mad," he said, "but you use touch just the right way. Maybe you can pull away somebody else's pain." As he spoke, he put his hands on my back and applied a bit of pressure. I hadn't read the stuff he was talking about, and he didn't really make a big deal out of it. There was nothing mystical about the moment, and he wasn't trying to be some kind of shaman. But damn it, if by the time he lifted his hands from my back, the pain was gone. I did notice that he shook his hands out as if he were shaking off whatever pain he had managed to soak up. "Get better, man. Let me know what you need," he said quietly, then left. I lay there, surprised to find myself relaxed and comfortable for the first time in weeks. I don't think Elvis was harnessing any supernatural powers to take my pain away. I think what really took away the pain was the kind of comfort that only a loving friend can provide. It's lonely and scary to be that hurt, and having Elvis care enough to do whatever he could to make me feel better to relax me and let me know I'd be looked after, meant everything to me. I think what made my back feel better wasn't any more mystical than the concern of a good friend. That summer my father came out for a visit, traveling in his usual vacation custom with 2 women, my stepmom, Lula, and Helen, the same friend of theirs that had been with us in Miami almost a decade before. We spent some time at the Perugia house where my father finally met Elvis. Elvis was extremely gracious and courteous, and said some very nice things about me to my father. I could see that little twinkle in my dad's eye. He liked knowing that I was doing okay for myself. I showed the visitors all around Los Angeles, and since the 4th of July fell during their trip, we decided we'd do something special that day. We'd take a ferry out to Catalina Island for lunch and be back in time for a homey backyard 4th party that Joni Esposito and some of the other wives were organizing. It was a great day, with Dad and the 2 ladies duly impressed by everything they saw. But after we got up to Perugia, Mike Keaton pulled me aside. "Listen, I thought you should know. Marty was real upset about you taking off today. I don't know what he might have told Elvis." Mike was one of the most solid and down-to-earth of the guys, and also one of the quietest. When he did speak up about something, it was worth paying attention to. I thanked him for the heads-up. The party was a pleasant family-style backyard barbecue, and just as it was starting to get dark, Elvis made his entrance. Even at his own parties he could make a hell of an entrance. He said his hellos, and after a while came over to where I was standing with my father and the ladies. "Did you take your daddy out to Catalina today?" he asked. "Yeah, Elvis, we had a nice time out there." He smiled and nodded. "Well, I'm proud of you. That's a real nice thing to do." Whatever the guys had been worried about, it wasn't bothering Elvis at all. He did have his black moods, and he had a temper, and sometimes he could be unreasonable, but a lot of times it was the personal politics around him that created more worry and fuss than anything he did. The temper and the moodiness were part of his makeup, but most of the time Elvis chose not to let them affect the way he treated other people. Looking back on all our time together, what's remarkable to me is not the handful of times that he did let a crazy temper get the better of him. What's remarkable is that, with all that went on in his life, most of the time he chose to be a nice guy. By the end of that summer, I was healed up enough for my bike accident to be back as a full-strength member of the Elvis team, and as preparations were made for the filming of Paradise Hawaiian Style, my job profile came to include an interesting duty. Because the film would include a couple of weeks of location shooting in Oahu, Colonel Parker was going to get to the island first and make sure everything was properly organized for Elvis. On such trips, the Colonel would travel with his chief lieutenant, Tom Diskin, and would also bring along one of Elvis's guys to take care of personal and security arrangements at the hotel we were using. This also meant that the Colonel, in his inimitable way, could keep tabs on the information flowing in and out of Elvis's inner circle. For this particular trip, he was also bringing along his wife and his teenage step-granddaughter, Sharon. I was the Elvis guy picked to travel with them. My security duties included making sure that access to the floor Elvis would be on could be controlled, and making sure that the hotel was going to allow us use of back doors and staff elevators. The primary concern was making sure that Elvis could be kept safe at the hotel and on the set, but I also made sure he could be comfortable, arranging for a piano to be brought to his room, and making sure that room service would have some of his favorite foods available at the hours he was most likely to want them. I took my responsibilities very seriously, but it was an education to witness the Colonel in action. He always maintained his outsized presence and bluff demeanor, but he backed it up with masterful organizational skills. From finalizing contracts, to working out police escorts, to overseeing special conditions on the set, there wasn't a single detail that the Colonel was not on top of, and not a single deal in which he didn't get the special treatment he was after for his client. In addition, he expertly worked press and publicity angles, creating an interest and excitement in the film that otherwise would not have existed. The Colonel may not have had a clue as to how to address Elvis's creative frustrations or spiritual questions, but he demanded that Elvis be treated as the biggest star in the world, and in his ability to have those demands met, he was astounding. My time in Hawaii started off in almost surreal fashion. On my first afternoon there, while the Colonel was off for a nap, I wandered down to the pool at the Ilikai Hotel, found a seat at a table near the poolside bar, and decided to order up the first Mai Tai of my life. I noticed a large table of guys who were talking and laughing it up together, and I was just a few sips into my drink when one of them started waving me over. I got up to approach and quickly realized that the guy doing the waving was actor Richard Harris, the great, angry young man of British film, who had sometimes been described as England's Brando. I thought he was great as a particularly angry rugby player in This Sporting Life, and I was also quite sure that he had no idea who I was. But that didn't seem to matter. He had me pull up a chair and join him and the members of his film crew from the epic production Hawaii. And before long he was talking to me like his new best drinking buddy, telling me all sorts of stories about his adventurous career. We proceeded to drink the afternoon away. Richard put down cocktail after cocktail, while I took my time with the one Mai Tai, which was strong enough to knock me back to my room for a nap later on. By the next day on the island, I realized that brushes with celebrity were nothing compared to the sheer natural beauty of the place I found myself in. Spectacular beaches, gorgeous mountain vistas, lush greenery, that sweet, balmy air that made every breeze feel like a kiss. I couldn't imagine any paradise better than the Hawaiian-style one all around me. And as we began filming at the Polynesian Cultural Center in Oahu, I saw that the beauty of the place was not just in the land, but in the Hawaiian people, too. The center had been founded by the Mormon Church just a couple of years before we got there, as a means of preserving the traditions of many of the South Pacific islands, Hawaii, Samoa, Fiji, Tahiti, and others, as well as offering a chance for some higher education to young islanders. Students could take classes at the nearby Brigham Young University Hawaii campus during the day, and in the evening they displayed crafts and artwork and performed traditional music and dance for the public. Filming at the center meant that many of these students were a part of our production, and on one of the first days that we shot a big production number, my eyes were drawn to one of the dancers, the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. All the dancers had a glowing beauty about them, but the way I felt my heart flip when I saw this one slight dancer. I knew it wasn't just the thrill of an infatuation with physical beauty. Watching her dance felt almost like a religious experience, and the more I watched, the more I felt drawn to her. In the days that followed, I couldn't take my eyes off this girl when she was around the set, and I couldn't stop thinking about her when I was back at the Ilikai. Finally, I approached her, feeling a lot more shy than I had around any L.A. girls. Her name was Sandy Cavello, and it took only a few moments of conversation to sense that she was as sweet as she looked, a woman whose inner beauty matched her physical charms. I was hooked, and I felt like there was a connection between us. But I couldn't figure out how any relationship would be possible once the shoot was over. Others took note of Sandy's exceptional beauty. Producer Hal Wallace set up a screen test for her in the middle of work on the film, a very big deal. I was pained at the thought of this pure, graceful creature being subjected to the whims of a studio. That was hard enough on Elvis, and was relieved when Sandy, though appearing just as beautiful on screen as she did in sunlight and moonlight, showed no interest in a Hollywood career. The Paradise shoot went smoothly, and our time on the island included one very moving side trip to the recently completed memorial built over the sunken USS Arizona. The battleship was a casualty of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Elvis and the Colonel had been very involved in raising money to get the memorial built, staging a hugely successful benefit concert for the Arizona in March of 1961, just before Elvis began work on Blue Hawaii. It had meant a great deal to Elvis to be able to give something back to his country that way, and for all the Colonel's usual attention to the bottom line, this had been a situation where he too wanted to be as charitable as possible. Elvis, the Colonel, Vernon, and the guys were given a special tour of the memorial by an admiral using his private boat. I could see how moved both Elvis and the Colonel were by the powerful tribute to fallen servicemen that their efforts had made possible. I remember standing next to Elvis at a rail that looked over the submerged ship, and we were shocked to see that oil from the engines was still bubbling up to the surface of the water. "Those guys are still down there," he said very softly. We had a few afternoons off during the course of the shoot, and on one of those days a group of the guys, Joe, Marty, Billy, Charlie Hodge, and myself, were with Elvis up in his hotel suite. Red West was with us, too. He had a part in the film as Rusty, a character who, in typical Red fashion, picks a fight with Elvis. Elvis could sometimes go long stretches without making any music outside of what was required for his soundtrack work, but in Hawaii, the relaxed pace of life, the warm breezes, and the sweet smell of the island's flowers must have put him in a more musical mood. The Ilikai had obliged my request for a piano by putting a baby grand in the room, and this day Elvis sat down at the keyboard and, without hesitation, began rolling out the chords of a favorite song of his that fit the tropical locale, Beyond the Reef. When Elvis sang a song like this, one that he had sung hundreds of times, it was almost as if the music just flowed right out of him. But as soon as the music began to fill the room, it wasn't just about Elvis anymore. The sound of that piano pulled us all together, and it took only a few bars before Red and Charlie joined in strong on harmony. The rest of us joined in too, although those of us who knew we might contribute a sour note if we pushed too hard kept things a little on the quiet side. We started singing through song after song: Red Sails in the Sunset, I'll Remember You, Cool, Cool Water, with Elvis sometimes picking the tune and sometimes following the suggestions of one of the guys. Elvis could be just as happy singing as a backup voice, adding Irish tenor harmony when Red or Charlie sang a strong lead on a tune. Just as our football games were a mix of serious sports and good times, the singing was a mix of some great music and a lot of kidding around. There was teasing and joking before and after almost every song, and a moment of sweet group harmony would lead to unrestrained laughter when somebody made a funny or risque alteration to some lyrics. Elvis himself was fond of changing Red Sails in the Sunset to Pat Sails in the Sunset. Pat was Red West's wife. Yes, it was Elvis's piano and his hotel suite and his movie that had brought us all there, but what you could feel in that room was the easy camaraderie of a great group of guys enjoying the simple pleasure of singing together before a Hawaiian sunset. After the last day of filming, the people of the Polynesian Cultural Center threw a farewell party for us at the Queen's Hut, a sign of great respect. It was a private affair, with students performing special dances just for us. Sandy performed a hula that had my heart in my throat. She was so pure and so radiant. All the wonderful performances started having an emotional impact on me that night. In some ways, we were simply in the middle of business as usual, putting together another Elvis film. But his connection to Hawaii and the Hawaiian people was deeply felt, and the open-hearted affection, respect, and appreciation they poured back at us was overwhelming. I wasn't the only one who responded to the emotions of the night. I rode back to the hotel sitting next to Elvis, and in the quiet hum of the drive I turned to look at him. There were tears running down his face. It's one of the few times I ever saw him moved enough to cry. My emotions got worked up all over again as we headed for the flight that would take us back to Los Angeles. Just as I was starting to reconcile myself to the fact that I'd never see Sandy again, she appeared with a special intricate flower lei for me that she'd made herself, her way of letting me know that our brief time together meant something to her as well. I've never been much of a letter writer, but I spent just about the entire flight back to the mainland composing a love letter to Sandy, and I sent it off to her as soon as I got hold of an envelope and a stamp. Just a week after we got back from Hawaii, a historic event took place at the Perugia house. Elvis met the Beatles. The group's second film, Help, had just come out, and they were in L.A. for concerts at the Hollywood Bowl. Despite the way Elvis felt about his career, the Beatles still considered him an idol, and pushed their manager, Brian Epstein, to work with Colonel Parker to set up a meeting. Elvis consented, and invited them to come by the Perugia house. After all sorts of elaborate security measures were put in place, the Beatles dropped by the house around 10 o'clock one August night. Career-wise, the Beatles were at the top of their game, putting out #1 records, garnering enthusiastic critical praise for their films, and creating pandemonium at all their sold-out concert appearances. But they seemed truly delighted to be meeting Elvis and were willing to defer to him to set the tone for the evening. Elvis wanted the evening to feel natural. Maybe it would be better history if this meeting of great talents had turned into some phenomenal jam session or an outrageous headline-making party, but in fact it had the quiet, easy-going feel of most get-togethers at the house. Well, as quiet and easy-going as is possible when you've got Elvis, the Beatles, Colonel Parker, Brian Epstein, and some Colonel-provided roulette wheels together in the same room. It's been reported that Elvis cold-shouldered the Beatles that night, or that he wasn't happy to have them in his house, but what I saw was Elvis welcoming them into his home the way he would anyone else, as Elvis. The guy was never a phony, and I never saw him change the way he acted to try to make any particular impression on the people he met. He wasn't going to suddenly become the sparkling host or the bubbly jokester for the sake of making a better impression. If he wanted to cold-shoulder you, you never got the invitation to come over. But if you were invited, you got Elvis. Things were a little awkward at first as introductions were made, and there was a lull when everyone first sat down together. But Elvis broke the ice by saying to the Beatles, "If you're just going to sit around and stare at me, I'm going to bed." Elvis and the guys began to laugh, and once the Beatles realized they were dealing with someone who shared their skewed sense of humor, everybody got along great. At some point, Elvis pulled out his Fender bass and began to play along with records, impressing Paul McCartney. One of Elvis's favorite tunes at the time was Charlie Rich's Mohair Sam, and he could really nail the bass line. Elvis also clearly got a kick out of some of the freewheeling banter of John Lennon, and they talked about their shared love of the films of Peter Sellers. I think for a good deal of the evening George was out back smoking something or other and kicking philosophical ideas around with Larry Geller. I hooked up with Ringo at the pool table, and we took on a team of Billy Smith and Mal Evans, the Beatles' tour manager. We won. Throughout the night, I kept finding myself bumping into John Lennon, and in our bits of joking conversation, we seemed to connect pretty quickly. From what I'd read and heard of him, I suppose I expected him to have more of an edge, but he was actually a bit on the shy side, extremely polite and good-natured, and of course funny as hell. He came up to me as the Beatles were finally getting ready to head back to the house they were staying at up in Benedict Canyon, a house that Elvis had considered renting for himself. "Jerry, I know Elvis can't get out, but if you want to come over to our place over the next 3 days, feel free." I thanked John, but I knew I wouldn't take him up on the offer. I was a Beatles fan and thought John was a tremendous guy, but I wasn't quite so independent a spirit as to start hanging out with the Beatles on my own. The next day I was up before anyone else at the house and decided to go for a motorcycle ride. After my accident, my Triumph had been beautifully rebuilt, customized, and repainted shades of metallic blue at no charge by the Robertson garage. There had been a multitude of fans trying to make their way past the police to Elvis's house all night, and as I prepared to speed off, I noticed one straggler who had made it up to Perugia, a beautiful blonde girl. I could appreciate how good-looking this girl was, but the sight of her just reminded me of how much I missed Sandy Cavallo. I was ready to drive on by when the blonde held up a hand to stop me. "Can I get a ride down to Sunset?" she asked. It seemed a little extreme to say, "No, I love a girl in Hawaii," so I indicated that she could hop on. I didn't say a word to her as we drove down to Sunset and began heading east. Finally, she broke the silence. "You know, the Beatles are in town. she shouted over the noise of the revving engine. I'm not sure what came over me. After all those years of being so secretive about my Elvis connection, all the situations where I could have dropped names or used my Elvis status to impress but didn't, I found myself wanting to show off a bit. You want to meet them? I shouted back. She laughed in my ear, as though she assumed I was kidding but wasn't quite sure. With perfect movie timing, I turned just before the Beverly Hills Hotel, gunned the bike up Benedict Canyon, and headed to the Beatles' pad. There was the predictable throng of fans outside the entrance to the hillside home the group was staying in, along with a large detail of policemen and sheriffs. I got my bike up to the gate of the driveway, but it seemed like it was going to be impossible to explain who I was and get past the security guards. I was about to motor away when I realized that someone was calling out my name. It was Mal Evans, my pool table opponent. Jerry, come on in. I was in. As I found a place to park the Triumph, Mal must have let John know that I'd come by, because when the girl and I got up to the door of the house, John was there to welcome us in. And again I was struck by what a warm and friendly guy he was, not at all the edgy cut-up he played in films and press conferences. He wasn't quite groomed into fab form yet. He had a towel wrapped turban-style around his just-washed hair. I don't remember how exactly I introduced my passenger, but I know that she quickly joined in with the informal party of Beatles people that drifted through a few of the bigger rooms, and I didn't see her again. I, on the other hand, was escorted out to a patio overlooking the spectacular canyon to hang out with the Beatles themselves. George and Paul were sitting around a table on the patio with their heads wrapped in towels, too. John sat down and indicated that I should take the fourth chair. John, Paul, George, and Jerry. I was sitting facing the canyon, and as the four of us talked, I saw a rather remarkable sight. A couple of girls had scaled their way up the almost perpendicular canyon wall to reach the fence around the edge of the patio. Just as they got there, ready to squeal, a couple of obviously well-practiced security guys scooped them up and carted them away. John, Paul, and George didn't even notice. I guess crazy fans being whisked away had become quite routine for them. I'd seen a lot of crazy things happen around Elvis, but no one had been scaling canyon walls to get to him lately. We talked some more, and then John leaned in toward me. Jerry, would you do me a favor? Well, sure, John. I couldn't say this to Elvis last night, but do you see these sideburns? I almost got kicked out of high school trying to be like Elvis. Tell Elvis that if it hadn't been for him, I would have been nothing. I'll tell him, John. Before I left that day, John made a point of getting a group picture signed for me. He and Paul and George signed it at the table, then John handed it to me. Ringo's on the phone with his wife. Go get him to sign it. Oh, I couldn't do that, John. I don't want to interrupt him. All right, said Lennon with mock exasperation. Come on, then. He led me through to the bedroom where Ringo was on the phone. Maybe our pool table triumph made the difference, but Ringo gave me a big smile and didn't seem to mind being interrupted to sign a picture. John took the picture back and added, To Jerry Schilling from the Beatles. It's still one of my most prized possessions. Back at Perugia, when the time was right and I was alone with Elvis, I passed along John's message. He smiled warmly and nodded. I could see he didn't want to talk much about it, but I could see the glimmer of pride in his eyes. He would have preferred to be competition rather than inspiration as far as the Beatles were concerned, but I know that the esteem they held him in meant a great deal to him. I went back to the Beatles' place the next day, this time with Billy Smith and Marty Lacker instead of a blonde. This was the afternoon of the first night of a 2-night stand at the Hollywood Bowl, and there was a bit more of a charged buzz inside. Paul was on a couch, strumming some chords on a guitar, and I went over to listen. John stood next to me. What Paul was playing reminded me of something I'd heard back in my time sipping coffee at the Bitter Lemon, and I decided to go out on a limb and talk music with Mr. McCartney. You know, that sounds a lot like a Joan Baez song. That's exactly what it is, said Paul. You want to meet her? Asked John. Before I could answer, he sprinted away and moments later came back towing Joan Baez by the arm. and a couple of hours later I was with her and John in one of 5 separate limos bringing the group to the bowl, a car each for John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Brian Epstein. At some point, John had asked Billy and Marty and me if we wanted to come to the show. Billy and Marty declined and headed back to the Perugia house, but I was swept up in the moment and had stuck alongside John. It was like a presidential motorcade pulling through town, with a police escort moving traffic out of the Beatles' path. I was impressed, but the ride gave me some time to rethink my decision to attend the concert. Elvis was happy to know the Beatles thought highly of him, but he might not be so happy to know that one of his guys had wandered off to a Beatles concert rather than stick by him. And while Marty hadn't managed to stir up any ill will around my Catalina excursion, this was the kind of odd test of loyalty that really might get Elvis upset. By the time we pulled through the artist's entrance under the bowl, I felt like I'd made a real mistake and couldn't get out of there fast enough. As the Beatles were ushered off to their dressing rooms, I commandeered somebody's car and driver and got myself back to Perugia Way. Elvis never said anything about it, and I have the strange distinction of being possibly the only Beatles fan ever to run away from a Beatles concert. As excited as I was to have the Beatles come to town, I was even more excited when I got word that I'd get the chance to see my favorite part of Hawaii again. Sandy was coming to Los Angeles for a visit. Through an intensive series of letters and then phone calls, I had discovered that she wanted to see more of me, too, and I'd put in motion plans to get her to L.A. Of course, her parents weren't about to send their young daughter to the mainland simply to be wooed by a friend of Elvis. The deal was that she would stay with the family of Jack Regas, the choreographer who had worked closely with the dancers of the Polynesian Cultural Center, both in designing the long-running show at PCC and in putting together the production numbers for Paradise Hawaiian Style. Jack had lived in Hawaii and had become close with Sandy's family, and it was acceptable that she would come over to visit Hollywood under his watch. I was with Elvis, finishing up the film on the Paramount lot, but Sandy and I spent as much time as we could together and went on a few chaste dates. One of those dates took us to the home of the Osmond family. Jack had also begun working with the Osmonds, who happened to live just down the street from him. There we spent the night learning some of the sign language the family used to communicate with a couple of older, non-performing siblings who were deaf. After a couple of weeks, it was time for Sandy to head back to her family. But as we went through another round of very emotional goodbyes, the nature of our relationship was inescapably clear. We were in love. By mid-October, after another cross-country drive with Elvis at the wheel, I was back at Graceland. Elvis had done 3 movies in 7 months, and had certainly earned himself a break. There were football games, nights at the Memphian, and hours spent with one of Elvis's latest favorite toys, low-slung, high-powered go-karts. I still considered myself lucky to be one of the few people in the world who went home to Graceland, but I also found myself growing increasingly preoccupied and unable to concentrate on much of anything. One day I was sitting by myself out behind the house, just staring out at the grounds. Suddenly there was a hand on my shoulder. I looked up to see Elvis. He waited a moment, and then spoke. "Jerry, you're just no use to me anymore." I'd heard that Vernon usually did the firing. At least I was getting the personal send-off. But I wanted to know why. "What do you mean, Elvis?" He handed me a thick, folded-up envelope. I opened it up, and was quite surprised to find that I was staring at an open-ended, round-trip ticket to Hawaii. I looked back at Elvis, unable to speak. "Go get her, man," he laughed. "Bring her back. Then maybe I'll be able to get some work out of you." Soon I was back in Oahu, living in the Polynesian Motel near the Cultural Center and waiting for Sandy to have some free time between her classes and her dance performances. She brought me fresh fruit every morning for breakfast on our way to the campus, and every time she left I was overcome with loneliness, counting the minutes until I'd see her again. In some ways, my romantic circumstances hadn't changed too much from all those times in New York that I had waited for Carol Cook, but it was a lot nicer to be stuck on a Hawaiian beach than in a New Rochelle basement. I started spending a lot of time with Sandy's extended family, who lived in traditional Polynesian style in a collection of humble homes overlooking a bay on the west side of the island. It wasn't always easy to understand each other. Most of her family spoke a mix of Polynesian and Pidgin English, but they were incredibly welcoming and friendly, and they accepted me and made me feel at home. I was a part of family luau's and even developed a taste for the dried octopus the women prepared on the family clotheslines. The only trouble I had fitting in was when Sandy's brothers took me out fishing. The smell of captured sea turtles mixing with the fumes from the small outboard engine and the non-stop rocking of the boat reduced me to a violently seasick haole, visiting white guy. By the end of my visit, Sandy and I were more in love than ever, and I had earned enough trust with her parents that they agreed to a rather unusual plan for their daughter. When she finished her studies for the term, she could come visit me in Memphis. That Christmas season was probably the happiest I'd ever had. I was living at Graceland, back to staying up late for deep conversations with Elvis, and waiting for the beautiful girl I loved to come be a part of my life. Only one thing bothered me. Getting a motorcycle from Elvis was one thing, but it seemed like my own pursuit of true love should have been paid for by me. I made a plan with Vernon that a few dollars would be subtracted from my paycheck each week until my ticket was paid off. I think Vernon was a little shocked that one of the guys was actually trying to give money back to Elvis, but he agreed to the plan. When Elvis eventually found out what I'd done, he was surprised too, and appreciative. The price of one plane ticket didn't mean anything to him, but I know he understood the feeling behind my settling of the debt. Graceland at Christmas time was always beautiful. The trees in front of the house were lit from beneath with soft-colored lights, decorations were everywhere, and there was a life-size nativity scene on the hill outside the front door. The place became a social hub, with all sorts of people coming by to pay their regards. This was also a time when Elvis was at his most generous. A few days before Christmas, he'd sit in the living room with his father and go through a list of 50 local Memphis charities he had asked the city to provide for him. He'd go through the list and ask Vernon questions about the groups. Vernon would have done his research and could tell Elvis exactly what each of the wide-ranging charities did and who they were helping. Every year, each of the charities on the list got a $1,000 check from Elvis. Some celebrities might have made a big PR moment out of that kind of giving, but for Elvis, it was private and personal, part of the holiday season in his home. Elvis was better at giving than receiving, and as one might imagine, he was a hard guy to pick out a present for. This particular Christmas, the guys managed to come up with something he really appreciated. Elvis had recently had a meditation garden constructed off to the side of the house past the swimming pool. It was designed to echo the feel of the Self-Realization Fellowship grounds. And we guys figured the perfect Christmas gift for Elvis would be a statue for the garden. Marty and I got in contact with my old art teacher, Bitter Lemon proprietor, and reigning Memphis bohemian John McIntyre, and commissioned a 4-foot statue of Jesus in his robes, with his arms outstretched, offering solace to all seekers. We put it up on a pedestal on a walkway in the meditation garden, and when we took Elvis out to show him, he was visibly moved. Visitors to Graceland can still see it in the same spot today. Not all the rituals we went through that Christmas were quite so traditional. After a great deal of reading up on the subject and a great deal of psychological preparation, Elvis had decided that he wanted to see what inner knowledge might be gained from an experience with LSD. I had no strong desire to experiment with drugs, but Elvis really approached it as a means of enlightenment, not just as a way to have kicks. Elvis had read some of Timothy Leary's writings, and he had been very excited about Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and I think he hoped that acid might provide the shortcut to the insight that he'd been after. I figured that whatever method he was going to use to better himself was worth a try for me also, and I still felt that whatever I did with him, I'd be safe. A few days after Christmas, Elvis, Priscilla, Larry Geller, and I split up some tabs of acid upstairs at Graceland. Larry had managed to procure the LSD. Sonny West was with us, too, to serve as a non-indulging assistant and security detail if any of us needed help along the way. We took the tabs, then sat around the big table in the conference room up there and just talked for a while. At some point, it seemed that no matter what anybody said, everybody else started laughing. I looked around at the people with me and felt like I was not just seeing them, but seeing into them, really knowing them for the first time. I figured maybe they were looking at me the same way, and I started to feel vulnerable, a little too exposed. And that's when the visuals started to kick in. I stared at Elvis sitting in his chair, and right before my eyes he seemed to morph into a child, a plump, happy little boy. And the more I stared, the more he shape-shifted, until I was seeing him as a great, big, chubby baby smiling back at me, contented as could be. I started laughing, and Elvis started laughing, and I realized we were in for quite an adventure. As the feelings and visions continued to get stronger and stronger, I became a little frightened. I started to wonder if the visions would ever stop, if I'd ever get back to normal again. I wanted to be in a safe, enclosed space, to try to get a hold on my reeling mind's eye. The spot that seemed safest to me was the walk-in closet in Elvis's bedroom, where I sat under the clothes hanging there. Once I felt properly protected, I began laughing again, and I heard Elvis laugh in response to my laugh. He was still down the hall in the conference room, but we began communicating by laughing back and forth, a call and response of rippling roars and gut-busting horse laughs. The laughter didn't feel forced or silly. It felt like a real conversation. When the laughter finally subsided, I peeked out from under the hanging clothes around me and saw an attractive creature, half cat and half woman, sort of rubbing and clawing its way along the bedroom wall and then stopping before a mirror. Priscilla, looking striking and beautiful and lost in a world of her own. After a while, Elvis, Priscilla, Larry, and I regrouped on the huge bed in Elvis's room. Elvis flicked on the TV that was mounted from the ceiling above the bed. We looked up and were immediately sucked into the Time Machine, the somewhat disturbing George Pal adaptation of the H.G. Wells story, starring Rod Taylor and a cast of future world mutants. It was a film we'd enjoyed before at Memphian screenings, but something felt a little off to me this time. The plot of the film somehow expanded around Rod and the mutants to include all of us on the bed. I felt like we were all in the movie, and that everything Rod and the other characters said applied to us. At some point, it occurred to the group that nobody had eaten for 10 or 12 hours. Pizza sounded like a good idea, and Sonny made the call to have some delivered. When they finally arrived, they smelled great. But I noticed something unusual. From the bottom of the crust to the topping, the pies looked to me to be about 3 feet thick. I had no idea how I was going to get my mouth around something like that. From the looks on my partners' faces as they tried to handle a slice, I could tell I wasn't the only one overwhelmed by the idea of wrestling our way through the mozzarella and pepperoni in front of us. Sonny had no problem knocking off a couple of slices, but the rest of us realized that food and LSD were not a great mix. After a few hours, when the drug's charged edge had started to wear off, we all went outside to walk the grounds. It was a misty morning, and the drops of dew seemed set on the grass and trees like so many jewels. For a good deal of the trip, I had felt set deep inside myself, my sped-up mind somehow apart from my slow-motion body. Now, drops blown off the trees in the morning breeze landed on my skin and served as a cooling come-down. I felt back together, and was both relieved to be at trip's end and thrilled at what we'd experienced. I also felt a rush of emotion for my fellow seekers. I guess everyone felt that, because I do remember that we all began to open up a bit, telling each other how important we were to each other, what good friends we were, and how much we loved being together. So much always went unsaid between all of us, But this was one of those rare and real times when everyone, even Elvis, spoke openly about our feelings and our friendship. Then, absolutely exhausted, we split up and went to bed. I remember that as I drifted towards sleep that night, it occurred to me that I had in fact achieved a kind of enlightenment. But it had come in a way I hadn't expected, and ended up feeling more personal than spiritual. I didn't feel elevated to some higher plane, but I did feel I'd been on an amazing adventure that would always be a part of the way I looked at things. The drug didn't deliver instant knowledge or awareness, but it pulled you on a journey that felt both noble and ridiculous. A jolting mix of self-realization fellowship and the fairgrounds Pippin. Seeing that little boy inside Elvis was an insight I knew I'd hang on to. Pizza a yard thick? Maybe there wasn't so much of a lesson there. Allowing ourselves to experience life in such a different way and giving each sense a new power of discovery was worth the trip. At the same time, I had no desire to take that trip again. I didn't, and neither did Elvis or Priscilla. And just as sleep was finally grabbing a hold of me, I had my most enlightened thought of the night. I had a great friend in Elvis, and I was living a damned good life. Chapter 7. A Mile in My Shoes. The genius of Elvis Presley was in his music, but the magic was in his voice. He was never more at one with his talents than when he was in the act of singing, putting that remarkable voice to work. One of the most memorable times I got to watch Elvis at work in the recording studio was in Nashville at the RCA Studios in the spring of 1966. He, Red West, and Charlie Hodge had been spending a lot of time informally jamming and working out ideas for songs. I hadn't tried to make a musical contribution since the day we were all driving through Beverly Hills and some catchy song came on the radio. We turned it up and everybody started taking a harmony part and singing along. I thought we had a strong quartet going, but Elvis turned around, looked at me, and said, "What's that noise?" I haven't sung since. Elvis was listening to newer sounds then and had become fascinated with the work of Odetta and Bob Dylan, people who managed to apply their musical talents to the same kind of soulful questioning and search for insight that Elvis had pursued in his books. Around this time I brought Elvis a Peter, Paul and Mary album, not a real natural fit with Memphis Mafia tastes, and I was very happy to see that it became one of his favorites. Elvis hadn't recorded a non-soundtrack album of fresh material in years, but that spring, with his mind set on finding some material of emotional and spiritual substance, he decided to record an album of gospel music. It would be titled after one of its standout tracks, How Great Thou Art. It was amazing to watch the work process in the studio, throughout which Elvis was confidently in charge of every detail. In this situation, he was clearly working for himself, not for an audience or a television camera or a film director. His music meant everything to him, and when it came to creating something he really cared about, he put himself into it completely. He picked the material. He worked out the arrangements. He went through all kinds of back and forth with the session players to work out all the subtleties of their parts. He brainstormed with his new producer, Felton Jarvis, over the general sound and setup for each track. The How Great Thou Art sessions marked the first time that Elvis and Felton had worked together. The young, enthusiastic producer was a huge Elvis fan and had once recorded an Elvis tribute song of his own, Don't Knock Elvis. He'd had some great success with Gladys Knight and the Pips and pop singer Tommy Roe, but one of the main reasons RCA had him on this session was that he was as much of a night owl as Elvis and had no qualms about working through the night. Right away, Elvis seemed to appreciate the positive energy and excitement with which Felton approached their sessions, and the two seemed very much in sync when they discussed the kind of feel Elvis wanted in his recordings. Of course, with Elvis in charge, the music-making process was quite a bit different than the movie-making process. On a movie set, time was strictly kept. A 7 a.m. call time meant you got started at 7 a.m. In the studio, a 7 p.m. session meant that Elvis might turn up around 7, but then he might do everything but record. There might be hours of hanging out before a note was sung. He could step out of his trailer on a movie set and deliver his lines for harum-scarum on demand, but when he sang, he was at his most open and exposed. His singing was at the core of who he was, and to perform as well as he wanted to, he had to feel some creative spark and a degree of inspiration. That spark couldn't always be tightly scheduled. I learned that studio hangout time was crucial to Elvis's getting into the right frame of mind. The studio was always part social club and part sanctuary for him, and whenever he was there, that's exactly where he wanted to be. He loved spending time with the musicians and enjoyed talking shop with them. There'd be laughing and talking and storytelling between Elvis and his players, his way of taking the pressure out of the situation. Felton himself was a tremendous storyteller with a great sense of humor, and Elvis couldn't get enough of his crazy tales of working with Fats Domino, one of Elvis's favorite performers. After the talk and the laughs, when Elvis felt things had built to just the right moment, he'd go to work. By the time of the How Great Thou Art sessions, most of the other guys had sat through dozens of recording sessions, and some of the mystique of Elvis in the studio had worn off for them. As on the movie sets, a lot of the guys that came with Elvis would spend some time watching and listening, but also spent a fair amount of time playing cards. Red and Charlie, though, were often very active participants in the studio sessions. They could speak the language of the Memphis guys as well as the language of the session players, and they worked as a pair of very critical bridges between the groups. Elvis made the final calls musically, but Red and Charlie were both talented and comfortable enough to offer musical input as well as moral support. I didn't have much to offer musically, but I had no interest in playing cards. I was interested in watching Elvis at work, and I was also fascinated by the whole studio process. I'd watch the engineer check the buttons on his console, watch the drummer set up and tune his drums, watch the careful placement of microphones. The sounds and the ambiance in the studio reminded me of the sounds you'd hear coming from a Broadway orchestra pit as the players loosened up and got ready for a big opening number. That was a lot more exciting to me than any game of 5-card stud. There was magic in that voice, but there was magic in those ears, too. I was blown away at how Elvis would shape not just his own performance, but the entire track. As the players began work on a new song, Elvis would call for all sorts of changes. He'd want the bass up, or the tempo slowed. He'd work out just how the background vocals should come in, and the manner in which they'd stack their harmonies. He'd work out with Felton how present he felt his vocals should be in relation to the backing track. He was dead serious about getting his music just right. He had learned from the best working with Sam Phillips in those early days. In fact, although he didn't take the credit often, I believe Elvis is the most underrated producer in rock and roll. When you put Elvis Presley in the studio with some decent material, what you got was never just an Elvis Presley vocal. You got the Elvis sound in every element of the music. Still, it was that voice, his instrument, that pulled it all together. He'd sing his vocals separately if he had to, but he liked to keep his performances as live as possible, and a lot of his takes were recorded with the band. And when he was done experimenting and was really shooting for a master take, you could feel the energy in the room. At that Nashville session, I found a spot at a window looking into the recording room and watched as Elvis delivered a transcendent performance while belting out the track, How Great Thou Art. All the showmanship of his stage performances just dropped away. It was just voice and microphone. But you could see in the intensity of his expressions that this one was coming straight from the soul. When he got to the dramatic finish of the song, there was a strange hush in the room. Nobody wanted to break the spell. I've been in a lot of recording studios since my time with Elvis, but I've never seen a performer undergo the kind of physical transition he did during that recording. He got to the end of the take, and he was as white as a ghost, thoroughly exhausted, and in a kind of trance. He was on, and everybody in the studio knew it, though no one in the room suspected that Elvis had just delivered his first Grammy-winning vocal performance. Elvis was hunched over, almost down on his knees. He seemed shaken, like he'd been touched by a little of what he had been searching for in his spiritual readings. He happened to look up. He saw me looking back at him, and a beautiful smile spread across his face. He knew I'd seen something special. Now, if Red or Charlie had been standing where I was standing, they would have gotten that smile. If Elvis had turned his head the other way, one of the session guys would have seen it, but it just so happened that I caught his eye and I saw the smile and got to share that moment. And that moment will stay with me forever. As a guy working for Elvis, receiving that kind of smile was even better than getting a motorcycle from him. Elvis may have treated the studio as his sanctuary, but many involved in the Elvis business did not treat it that way. One of the regulars at the studio card games was Freddie Beanstalk, the representative of the Colonel-sanctioned Hill and Range Publishing Company, owned by Gene and Julian Aberbach, through which all of Elvis's material was supposed to be supplied. The Colonel was especially proud of his dealings with Hill and Range, which had set up a pair of separate publishing firms for Elvis, Elvis Presley Music, and Gladys Music. Since Elvis had signed his first RCA deal in 1955, the Colonel and Hill and Range had overseen a lucrative system in which Elvis got a piece of the publishing of every song he recorded. And at first, that system worked fine. In the 50s and early 60s, songwriters generally had a low profile in the music world and were willing to do anything to get a song recorded by a star, including giving up a huge share of songwriting royalties. But in the era of the Beatles and Dylan, the songwriter was the star, and top writers were no longer willing to give anything away. Elvis had a great sense of what songs would work for him, and early in his career he had picked most of the songs he wanted to record. There was a special drawer down in the Graceland TV room where he kept some favorite records, songs he had some kind of emotional connection to, some dating back to his high school days. From those 45s and 78s, Elvis would very carefully select a song or two he felt ready to take on, and he'd carry those precious bits of vinyl off to the recording session with him. If the studio was his sanctuary, that drawer was full of scripture, and everything he pulled from there was chosen and performed with love. Elvis always had the freedom and the power to bring in a song to a session. If Elvis was excited about it, the businessmen would keep quiet and arrangements would be made. But increasingly, when Elvis was asked to pick material from a pile of Hill and Range selected songs, he found himself listening to material he just couldn't get excited about. Elvis trusted that the people around him would be trying to get top material for him, and sadly, he was just way too trusting in that regard. It may have been frustration over material or frustration with the lousy script for his next film, Double Trouble, but for some reason, on June 10, 1966, when we were back in Nashville for more sessions at RCA Studio B, Elvis was in a foul mood. He didn't want to go to the studio at all, so an unusual Plan B was put into effect. Since one of the 3 songs scheduled to be worked on that night was a Red West composition, If Every Day Was Like Christmas, Elvis decided he would stay at our Nashville lodging, the Albert Pick Motel, and Red, Marty, and Charlie would go to the studio so that Red could sing reference vocals while the session musicians laid down the 3 backing tracks. I was the guy Elvis chose to stay with him at the Albert Pick, though it could sometimes be considered hazardous duty to be sitting up with a moody Elvis. His room at the Albert Pick wasn't anything special, just a small, typical motel bedroom. As usual, tinfoil was up on the windows to keep it dark, and Elvis had the air conditioning turned up so high it felt like a meat locker. His mood was about as dark and cold as the surroundings. I did what I could to keep him distracted and comfortable, and between ordering some food and watching some TV, I tried to keep the conversation light and minimal. Hours later, there was a knock at the motel door, and I let in Red, who was carrying a small tape machine. He asked if Elvis wanted to hear the results of the evening's work there, and Elvis gave him a not very enthusiastic okay. Red played the tapes of the 3 tracks, with and without his scratch vocals. His Christmas song, I'll Remember You, and Indescribably Blue. For the first time that night, I saw Elvis's expression warm, and he let himself relax. He sat cross-legged on his bed, nodding along with the rhythm, mouthing the words and getting lost in the music. I think he must have appreciated how strange and daunting it had been for Red to try to step into his shoes, and now, listening to Red's remarkably Elvis-like stand-in performance, I think he did get a sense of just how much his friends were willing to put themselves on the line for him. "That's it, man, that's it," Elvis said when the tape ended. I'm pretty sure that was all Red needed to hear to make his night. But Elvis wasn't quite through with that tape. Something about Indescribably Blue had fanned a creative spark, and he wasn't going to let the moment pass. He wanted to make some music. Red quickly hooked up the machine's dinky little microphone and flipped a few switches so that Elvis could hear one channel while recording into the other. Elvis plumped up the pillows behind him on the bed, got himself settled against the backboard, pulled the little tape machine close, and set the mic out in front of him. Then he started playing the backing track. And he started singing. Now, Indescribably Blue is no throwaway tune. It's an intense, emotional, vocally demanding ballad. And sitting there in his pajamas at the Albert Pick Motel, with a battery-powered tape player in front of him, Elvis nailed it. But this vocal performance was almost the polar opposite of what I'd heard him do in the studio. This time, the music came out of him so easily, as naturally as breath. I sat there on the foot of the bed as Elvis moved from the song's almost whispered confessional opening to its heartbroken crescendo, and then back down to its trembling finale. With his eyes shut, singing out to that little plastic mic with calm and tenderness, he casually, quietly packed everything he loved about singing into the 2.5 minutes of Indescribably Blue. I think, for him, the Albert Pick Motel just disappeared. He didn't know where he was, and he didn't care. He let himself get lost in that song. And when he was through, you could see the change. The black mood had lifted. The AC was still cranking, but the big chill had passed. That little moment of music in a motel room had done something big for him. It satisfied his soul. Life with Elvis changed quite a bit for me in 1966. Most significantly, I moved out of the Graceland basement. Sandy did come to Memphis at the end of the Christmas season in '65, and rather than subject her to the bare bulbs, dangling insulation, and seeping puddle of my room, Elvis arranged for us to have a place in the apartment building directly across the street from the estate, behind where the Graceland shops and ticket counters are today. Charlie Hodge, still single, inherited the spot in the basement. I knew I was in love, and I wanted to do right by Sandy, who was leaving a lot behind to come step into our crazy world. But I have to say it was hard to give up that ugly little room in Graceland. It was hard to have to leave at the end of the night and head back out through those gates I'd wanted so much to come through. It felt both wonderful and surreal to be living with my Polynesian love in our own apartment. We had fallen in love and gone through a dramatic courtship, and it was strange now in Memphis to finally settle down and really get to know each other. We had never even spent the night together in Hawaii or Los Angeles, and now we found ourselves building a life together. Sandy was as beautiful out of her home environment as she had been in it, but where she had once been safely looked after by her family, now she was vulnerable, and it hit me just how much she was depending on me, and how responsible I was for her. For her part, Sandy never complained at all about what must have been a rough transition, and day after day I was even more taken with her calm, her grace, and her loveliness. My relationship with Sandy may have pulled me out of Elvis's house, but as a couple we had the opportunity to connect with Elvis and Priscilla on a different level. For one thing, they could see the sweetness, beauty, and honesty in Sandy as clearly as I could, and they welcomed her into their life as a new member of the family. When Grandma had first heard I was in love with a Hawaiian girl, she looked very concerned and said, "Oh, son, why don't you settle down with an American girl?" But when Sandy finally came over, Grandma warmed up to her and eventually thought of her as family, too. Priscilla and Sandy were from very different backgrounds, but their jumps from stable family homes to the craziness of the Elvis world gave them a lot in common. Priscilla and Sandy gradually became good friends, and Elvis and I spent a lot of time together with the ladies, going for walks, going for drives, spending time in the meditation garden, and enjoying each other's company. There was enough of a bond between the four of us that Elvis felt comfortable taking us along when he made his trips to his mother's grave. Life was good, but with all that was going on around Elvis, it sometimes seemed that every silver lining had a way of finding a cloud. I remember one warm evening, the four of us decided to take a drive down to the Mississippi River in Elvis's newest Cadillac Eldorado convertible. We were driving along, watching the sunset over the water, when Elvis's new single came on over the radio. I can't quite remember which single it was. I was thinking that the moment was perfect. A caddy, two beautiful women, and Elvis both at the wheel and on the radio. But suddenly the car was turned 180 degrees around and we were heading back to Graceland at about 100 miles an hour. When we got there, Elvis jumped out of the car looking like he was ready to kill somebody. He headed upstairs, and I don't think we saw him for a couple of days. When I did see him again, it was in the back room of the house where I was hanging out with a couple of the other guys. Now Elvis was looking more concerned than angry. "Look, I know you guys think I'm crazy, but Jerry, go down to the record store down the street and buy that single." I went down to the record store closest to Graceland and got the record. When I brought it back to Elvis, he took it downstairs to the TV room along with an acetate of the same song. Elvis wanted to be involved in every step of the recording process, and the last step was always for him to listen to an acetate, a kind of test pressing of the takes and mixes he was approving, and then he'd sit through the mastering of those recordings with the engineer. He assumed, as anybody would, that what he heard and approved was what a listener would eventually hear when they bought the record. Down in the TV room, he put his acetate on and played the song. Then he put the actual single on, and even a non-musician like me could hear the difference. There was a marked drop in punch and volume. His voice was forward in the mix, and the band and background vocals had just about disappeared. To put it bluntly, the song had lost its balls. Elvis just stood there shaking his head, and I don't think any of us knew what to say, except that we heard the difference. I remember the word that came to mind for me, a word out of my Catholic school days: sacrilegious. Here's one of the greatest talents of his time, and rather than just let him do what he did so well, the business people around him kept finding new ways to mess with his music. Sadly enough, I think one of the reasons my memory's foggy about this single is that the same scene happened more than once.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.
When we were all back in Memphis, there were still football games and nights at the fairgrounds or the Memphian. There was also a new leisure activity that was undertaken with typical Elvis-style intensity: slot car racing. Priscilla had given Elvis a beautiful track for Christmas, and he got excited enough about it that within a couple of weeks he'd gone out and bought a huge professional arcade-sized track. He set it up in an extension to Graceland he had built off the music room. For a while, racing those little cars was just light-hearted fun, but pretty quickly, all of us guys had our own personalized slot car, and those races were intensely competitive and treated as very serious business. Serious enough that during one heated set of qualifying laps, Marty Lacker and Red West came close to throwing punches over who'd nosed out who at the finish line, an argument that sparked probably the biggest fit of temper I ever saw Elvis unleash. He had his frustrations over the movies, and he got understandably upset when his music was tampered with, but the one thing he absolutely wouldn't stand for was disharmony in the group. When the guys went after each other in a mean or petty way, it drove Elvis crazy, and when he got crazy, He was not the type of guy to talk through his feelings. So as words were exchanged between Marty and Red over that slot car track, there was suddenly another sound, the sound of Elvis erupting. He lifted up his hefty metal control box and smashed it down hard on the track, shattering lengths of it into pieces. "God damn it, if you guys want to argue about something, argue about who's going to clean this shit up," he yelled. He smashed a bit more, then headed out of the room. No, it wasn't a pretty picture. But I will say this, Red and Marty didn't exchange one more word about who had the faster slot car. Elvis had multi-million-dollar contracts to live up to, and he couldn't see any way to step back and figure out where it was all heading. Now his friends couldn't even race slot cars without bickering and sniping at each other. Why not smash something up? It wasn't long after that the slot car track disappeared entirely and the extension became Elvis's trophy room, home to his gold records, plaques, and awards, and fans' scrapbooks from all over the world. Out in L.A., there had been some changes in the housing situation. By early 1966, Elvis had moved out of the Perugia house and into a new one on Rocca Place in Bel Air, and compared to the bachelor pad feel of the former, the new home felt much more domesticated. In addition to Elvis and Priscilla, the Rocca inhabitants included Sandy and me, Marty Lacker, and Patsy Presley and her husband, G.G. Gamble, dubbed Muffin by Elvis for his easygoing nature. Elvis would star in 3 more films that year, first making Spin Out and Double Trouble at MGM, and Easy Come, Easy Go back at Paramount. Once during a lunch break on a location shoot day for Spin Out, Elvis had Alan Fortas bring some of our motorcycles to the set, and we'd go for rides through Topanga Canyon, often with Spin Out co-star Deborah Wally sitting on the back of Elvis's Harley. I had a chance to get to know another co-star, Shelley Fabre, a little better during some of the filming. In a scene in which Shelley's car goes off the road and into a little lake and Elvis wades in to help her, I was working as Elvis's stand-in. We were working late in the day and we needed to do many takes of the characters in the water, so I had a wetsuit on under my wardrobe. Shelley had on only wet wardrobe, however, and I knew just how cold she had to be in that water. Alan Fortas came up with a solution. He thought a few sips of brandy might help keep Shelley warm, so he passed a small bottle to assistant director Claude Binion, who rowed a small boat out between takes and delivered it to the actress. Shelley wasn't a drinker, and she may have had more than a few sips. Fighting her way through the cold and the brandy, she bravely finished the scene. We could see why she was one of Elvis's very favorite co-stars. Elvis himself was quite protective of his Double Trouble leading lady, a British girl named Annette Day. Annette didn't have any acting experience, not even in a high school play, but the producers thought she had the perfect look to play against Elvis in a story about European intrigue. Elvis wanted Annette to feel comfortable throughout the production and tried to help her out any way he could. So when he heard that she didn't have a car of her own, he gave her one. This was typical Elvis generosity. But the trouble this time was that the car he gave her was mine, a '64 Mustang that I had purchased for Sandy and myself. One day on the set, Elvis simply said, "Jerry, you got the paperwork on that?" And the deal was done. Annette Day was a Mustang owner. Of course, Sandy and I didn't get stuck taking the bus around town. Elvis bought us a convertible Cadillac as a sign of appreciation for our unintentional generosity. And Sandy and I weren't the only drivers Elvis put in a Cadillac. He bought several of them, all convertibles, for me, Red West, Sonny West, Joe Esposito, Richard Davis, Alan Fortas, Larry Geller, and Marty Lacker. The cars were offered to us in a great spirit of friendly giving, and Elvis explained his generosity by telling us, "Hell, we were all poor kids from Memphis. We deserve it." And just as we had ridden our matching motorcycles together as the Bel Air Bonnevilles, we celebrated our Cadillac ownership one afternoon by putting all the tops down and caravanning along Sunset Boulevard and out onto the San Diego Freeway. George Klein was out in L.A. to take a bit part in Double Trouble, and he had connections with the sensational soul singer Jackie Wilson. When Wilson did a run of nights at a Sunset Strip club called The Trip, Elvis and the rest of us went out to catch a show. Elvis and Jackie hit it off well enough that night that Elvis invited Jackie to come to the MGM lot to watch a day's shoot. If you look carefully at a couple of the music sequences in Double Trouble, you may notice that Elvis doesn't really move in patented Elvis fashion. There's something different about the way he snaps his fingers and twists his torso. In fact, he's doing his best Jackie Wilson impression, because Jackie Wilson is standing about 10 feet away. All those smiles Elvis is directing off-screen are directed right at Jackie, and the two of them cracked up together after every take. Elvis also memorably borrowed some Jackie moves when he performed Return to Sender in 1962's Girls, Girls, Girls. That night back at the house, Elvis and some of us were sitting around, and talk turned to what a great performance we'd seen at the Jackie Wilson show. I mentioned that I couldn't understand how a guy that talented hadn't broken out bigger yet. Why wasn't he doing bigger concerts and film and television? Elvis shook his head slowly. Man, Jackie and I were talking about that today. He's in a hard place. What do you mean, eh? I asked. I told him he was a good-looking guy. He should be doing movies. He said he really wanted to, and he'd had some interest from the studios, but his manager won't let him out of his nightclub commitments. I think there's a lot of mob connections there, and Jackie just can't break out of it. They won't give him enough time away from the club dates to make a picture. Thinking about Wilson's situation later, I couldn't help but see a parallel with Elvis. Elvis wasn't dealing with people who'd break his legs, but he was in a position where the connections that had helped get him to where he was were getting in the way of doing the work he truly wanted to do. Seemed like no matter how talented you were, somebody could find a way to box you in. Colonel Parker had apparently been impressed enough with what he'd seen of me on the Hawaii trip that he thought I could be useful to him. So I became a loan-out to him one day a week, spending the day in one of the massive offices he had on either movie lot. His headquarters on the MGM lot was an entire dance studio converted to office space, complete with its own kitchen. Both spaces were decorated with Elvis movie posters and all kinds of Elvis merchandise. The office decor also featured a fantastic number of expensive ivory carvings and marble representations of the Colonel's favorite animal, the elephant, most of them gifts from affectionate friends and business associates. You could never get too comfortable around the Colonel, but it was still a pleasure to watch him work. He'd call for a lunch meeting at his office with top entertainment executives, guys who were used to lunches at 3- and 4-star restaurants around town, and serve them his special hobo stew, or a homely plate of cold cuts. During those cold-cut luncheons, a big plate of ham always seemed to end up in front of the Jewish Abe Lastfogel, president of the William Morris Agency, and someone the Colonel considered a good friend. Whatever offense Lastfogel might have otherwise taken was probably balanced out by the fact that the only nice piece of furniture in the Colonel's office was a special leather chair with Lastfogel's name engraved on it. The Colonel had a system of barking like a dog to summon his assistants. 1 bark for one particular staffer, 2 barks for another, which was funny unless you didn't respond promptly to the bark, in which case you might be subject to a severe talking to. And the Colonel was a primary catalyst for pranks and hijinks on the otherwise dreary film sets of this period. One of his favorite gags was to show off some alleged hypnosis skills. He'd put Billy Smith in a trance and instruct him to go sit in the director's chair, a huge no-no in Hollywood. Or he'd pretend to put Red and Sonny and some of the other guys under his spell and tell them that they were dogs. They'd be down on the floor of the set barking and howling away, and the Colonel would puff away on his cigar with a contented smile on his face. On the one hand, he was playing the role of crazy uncle who wants everybody to have a good time, but it was also his way of reminding the cast and crew around him, I'm in charge and will do as I please. I remember watching those guys down on all fours howling away and thinking, I'm not going to do that. I know the other guys felt that it was all in good fun, but it looked humiliating to me. I don't know what would have happened if the Colonel insisted I join in, because I was never tested. To the Colonel's credit, he was an expert at reading people and instantly understood how far he could push someone. He never once tried to turn me into a dog. One day I was working in the colonel's office when a young, good-looking guy came through the door with a big bag of something. He looked vaguely familiar to me, but before I could ask who he was or what he wanted, he yelled out, "Colonel, I've got some sausage from the President." "Come on in here, George," the colonel bellowed back from his room. It was actor George Hamilton delivering some Texas sausage, care of Lyndon Johnson. The colonel and the president had met back when Johnson was a senator, and the colonel had arranged for country star Eddie Arnold to sing at a private party Johnson was throwing. They hit it off right away, with the colonel quickly inducting the senator into an exclusive private club, the Snowmen's League. Snowmen were those who were expert in the art of snowing, the ability to con, charm, fool, flim-flam, or otherwise pull the wool over someone's eyes. Membership in the league was only open to those the colonel deemed worthy. I still have my own league membership card. Hamilton was now dating Johnson's daughter and had also become very friendly with the head snowman. For all the colonel's bluster, you could never overestimate how well connected he was. On another day at his office, I got a glimpse of the more manipulative side of the colonel's management techniques. Elvis never wanted the colonel around the recording studio, and the colonel had no particular desire to be there. He'd send a representative like Tom Diskin instead. Of course, the colonel kept tabs on everything that came out of the studio. Working in his office, I overheard the colonel talking on the phone with somebody at RCA. It was never hard to overhear the colonel. He made a comment about a recording Elvis had just done, which had been circulated as an acetate but hadn't been put out yet. "My wife Marie says she can't hear Elvis with all that stuff going on," the colonel said. "It's an Elvis record, but you can't hear Elvis." That's how the records got changed. The colonel would never be so heavy-handed or traceable as to try to override a mix Elvis had okayed, but in his indirect way he was making a demand. And that kind of conversation between the colonel and RCA is what led to Elvis's records not sounding the way Elvis wanted them to sound. Looking back, maybe I should have gone to Elvis and told him about that phone conversation right then, but at the time I felt that trying to put myself between Elvis and the colonel was only going to make things worse all the way around. I spent more time with the colonel after he was loaned a house in Palm Springs by the William Morris Agency, and decided that I should be one of the guys to drive him to and from L.A. These days involved a lot more than just driving, however. I had meals with the colonel and his wife. I accompanied him for long sits in the sauna and steam bath at the Palm Springs Spa Hotel, and I sometimes split a secret beer with him out in the tool shed behind his home. His wife disapproved of his imbibing. Getting that relaxed around the colonel required a delicate balancing act. I knew that Elvis absolutely did not want the colonel involved in his personal life. I had to be on guard as I sat in the car on those 2-hour rides back to L.A., with the windows rolled up and the colonel puffing away on his cigar. Sometimes he'd sit in silence for 45 minutes, just staring out the window. You could almost hear his mind whirring away. But sometimes he would begin to ask questions, and I knew that the colonel's most innocent-sounding questions might lead to information being passed along that Elvis would not be happy about. The more the colonel inquired about things that seemed unimportant, the more careful I'd be about my answers. I was starting to enjoy time with the colonel, but I was always aware that my true loyalties were with Elvis. As much as the business and personal sides of Elvis were supposed to stay separate, the colonel had a keen interest in having somebody he could depend on within Elvis's inner circle, and he and Vernon had discussed putting me in the Elvis foreman spot during the period when Joe Esposito was gone, and the colonel felt that Marty Lacker was not communicating well with him. The most I heard about this was when Vernon offhandedly remarked, "Marty's not getting the job done. The colonel and I were talking about you." The situation was resolved when Joe returned as co-foreman, and frankly, I was relieved, knowing that Joe was the right guy for the job. Spending time with the colonel on those drives, I picked up a couple of insights into his mercurial character. First, for all his psychological gamesmanship and sly personal politics, as a businessman, the colonel was not a bullshitter. He told you what he wanted, told you what he'd give you, and when he said a deal was a deal, it was done. People could always say no to him. It's just that most didn't. Second, as much as he's come to be seen as a heavy in the Elvis story, a reputation partly deserved, the odd thing is that he was fun to be around. As dominating as he could be, he was highly entertaining. Lastly, I came to realize that in some ways Elvis and the Colonel were a lot alike. Strong, smart, stubborn men who had become centers of power in worlds of their own making. In the fall of 1966, during the filming of Easy Come, Easy Go, Elvis and I were living with Priscilla and Sandy in the same house and spending just about every minute of the long workdays together. I suppose it was inevitable that at some point the mix of professional and personal lives would become combustible. It was a day early in the shoot, maybe one of those still photography days that Elvis hated, and he was in a lousy mood. He was sitting in his makeup chair in his dressing room, and he was being crabby to all the guys around him that day. But when he went at me, something snapped. I knew when it was smart to defer to Elvis, to let him vent, but this time he brought Sandy into it. I don't remember exactly what his complaint was, but one of the guys had told Elvis that Sandy had said something to Priscilla that made her suspicious about Elvis's behavior. I knew that Sandy was too smart and, by nature, too sweet to have done that. I tried to stay calm. "Elvis, she loves you and she wouldn't do that," I said. "You know that." The words didn't seem to sink in at all. "Yes, she did," he said. I could tell that he didn't have a real gripe with Sandy, that he was just being disagreeable. But I was feeling protective of Sandy, and I just wasn't in the mood to defer. Instead, I exploded. "No, Elvis, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just in a bad mood." There was no faster way to move Elvis from a bad mood to a worse mood than by telling him he was in a bad mood. He got out of his chair, fast. We stood face to face, hollering at each other, waiting to see who would back down first. But neither of us backed down. We just got louder. I'd been holding a briefcase when we started yelling, and now I flung it across the room hard enough to smash it open against the wall. Elvis stepped back just long enough to pick up a huge glass ashtray off an end table and hoist it up in the air. I didn't know if he was going to smash that too, or if he wanted to bring it down on my head, but I decided I didn't want to find out. I wheeled around and started walking. And walking. I was so enraged at Elvis that I didn't want anything to do with anything connected to him, and that included his cars. Rage has a curious energy to it, and apparently I was angry enough to walk from the Paramount lot to the Rocca Place house, a 10-mile hike. I don't remember making the decision to do so. I just remember that by the time I hit Hollywood Boulevard and took a left toward Bel Air, it occurred to me that after 12 years of knowing Elvis, this was our very first argument. It also occurred to me that my plan not to have anything to do with him had a serious flaw in it. I was, after all, walking home to his house. If I kept on walking, I wasn't just quitting a job. I was walking away from everything I thought I'd wanted, sending myself back to square one. I guess that thought made me even angrier because I kept on going, stomping over the stars of Hollywood Boulevard. I decided I'd pack up and get Sandy and myself out of Elvis's life as soon as possible, moving on to a big question mark of a future. The flash of anger in my eyes must have done something for my looks. At one point on Hollywood Boulevard, I was stopped by a guy who pulled up alongside the curb and announced that he was a scout for a modeling agent. I'd been in Los Angeles long enough to know a line when I heard one, and it didn't help my mood to think that I could be mistaken for a male hustler. I kept walking, though I did take note that the guy's front seat was covered with industry trade papers and headshots. The car pulled around the corner, and a moment later the driver was walking toward me, looking apologetic, saying again and again that he didn't want to give the wrong impression, but would I be interested in an agency audition? My head had cleared enough to allow a coherent thought to come through. If I had really just quit working for Elvis, I could use a job. The more the guy talked, the more legit he seemed, and when he offered to walk me over to a modeling agency down the street, I accepted. Moments later, I was sitting in the reception room of the Nina Blanchard Modeling Agency, waiting to be seen by Nina Blanchard herself. The name meant absolutely nothing to me at the time, but I later found out that this was the top agency of its day, and nobody could ever expect to simply walk in off the boulevard and get a meeting. But there I was. Ms. Blanchard liked my look. I guess there was still enough rage in my eyes, but was a little irritated that I didn't have a headshot or resume to give her. She wanted me to come back for a proper audition when I had all the required paperwork together. I thanked her, headed back out to Hollywood Boulevard, and kept walking to Bel Air. When I finally got back to the house, I stewed around for a while, going over the fight with Elvis. Every time I ran it through my head, I ended up just as angry. But more and more, sadness was creeping in, too. I could find another job somewhere, but maybe I'd just lost my best friend. I started packing and thinking about how I'd explain the move to Sandy. I'd gotten the suitcase about half full when I realized Elvis was at the door. I stopped what I was doing. There was a very awkward moment, with both of us trying to not really look at the other, and neither one knowing what to say. But just being that close and that quiet, I felt something shift a little. Had he been a jerk? Yes. Had I overreacted? Probably. We both had nasty tempers. But now we were both cooled down. The guy standing at the door was the guy I'd been enraged at all day, but now that he was right there, I had no desire to pick up where we'd left off. And I could tell from his downcast gaze and uneasy stance that he wasn't in any kind of fighting mood. We could both feel that the emotions in this room were a lot different from those left behind in the Paramount dressing room. We just weren't sure what to do. Elvis was never much of a hugger. We guys were much more likely to get hit than hugged by him. But without a word, he came across the room, put his arms up, and we joined for a quick, easy embrace. In a flash, I realized that I really didn't want to go anywhere. We were still silent. I didn't feel like rehashing the fight or sorting it out, and I know he didn't either. I just quietly started reaching into the suitcase and putting my clothes back in the drawers of my dresser. And quietly and carefully, Elvis began to help, gently moving a few things from suitcase to drawer. This was a guy who didn't pick up his own clothes. To have him put away a pair of my socks meant a lot. It meant that, for the moment, Hollywood was going to be short one male model. Chapter 8. Rising Sun. The phone rang at our apartment one day about a week before Christmas. I recognized the voice right away. "Jared, come on over. Meet me in the dining room for breakfast." Typically, everybody around Graceland just grabbed breakfast whenever and wherever they were in the mood for it. An invitation to a breakfast in the dining room was unusual, but a little while later I was sitting there with Elvis, digging into eggs and bacon. I could tell he had something to say that he felt was important, but I had no idea what it might be. We talked about nothing in particular for a while, and then he got to his point. "Jerry, I want to buy something special for Priscilla for Christmas. I want to surprise her with a horse." "That's a great idea, Elvis." "Well, do you mind if I buy Sandy one too, so the girls can ride together?" "Man, are you kidding? Sandy would love a horse. Sure, go ahead." He drained the rest of his coffee cup. His face lit up with a big smile. "You ever gone horse shopping?" An hour later, we were heading out toward the Memphis airport on a horse-buying mission. Elvis was at the wheel of a big old pickup truck he had bought for Graceland, and we headed out to see a local horseman, William Spence, who had a wide variety of horses for sale. Spence had a Graceland connection. He had managed the horses there for the previous owners and ran the Graceland Farms Saddle Club on some adjacent property. When we got to Spence's place, I discovered that Elvis had another reason for bringing me along on this trip. I wasn't just there to okay a gift to Sandy. I was going to be Elvis's official jockey. I didn't know a damn thing about horses at the time, but Elvis had been badly spooked by a runaway ride during one of his early films, and he wasn't eager to get up in the saddle again. so I was the one who got up on each of the potential gift horses. I quickly learned some of the crucial equestrian basics. A Western saddle gave you something to hold on to, while an English saddle left you no choice but to pray that the horse didn't hate you. I was sitting on horse after horse at farm after farm, just getting bounced around and trying like hell to stay on. And the harder I tried to stay on, the harder Elvis laughed. I started to get the feeling that he wasn't even really looking at the horses anymore. He was just laughing his head off watching me. Eventually we found the two perfect gift horses. A beautiful black quarter horse for Priscilla, and a chestnut sorrel horse for Sandy. And our brief, exciting life as cowboys began. Elvis had come up with a perfect gift. Priscilla and Sandy were thrilled with their horses and began riding together frequently. Petite Priscilla was deceptively athletic and a real natural rider. She often rode bareback on her horse, Domino. One of the loveliest sights around Graceland at the time was that of Priscilla and Sandy riding together, both of them with beautiful long black hair that blew in the wind and bobbed to the rhythm of the ride. The Graceland property included a run-down barn, stables, and corral fences, and Elvis decided that he wanted it fixed up so that he could keep horses on the property. But he wasn't just going to write a check and have all that taken care of. This was going to be a hands-on project. He'd be the carpenter, he'd be the painter, and in the case of some extra buildings on the property that needed to be taken down to create a riding area, he'd drive the bulldozer. So, between trips to the local tack shops, to pick up harnesses, saddles, ropes, and everything else we needed for the horses, Elvis and I began spending time together hammering away at planks in the barn and mending fences. And Elvis being Elvis, almost every day we were taking another trip somewhere to buy another horse. A quick note on the bulldozing that tells you just how Elvis could be. Vernon had already purchased a little bulldozer for work around Graceland, but that wasn't big enough for Elvis's tastes. I came back to Graceland one afternoon to find Red West riding the little bulldozer, and Elvis wearing a football helmet and sitting at the controls of a monstrous D9 industrial-grade bulldozer, looking pleased as could be as he flattened everything in his path, which, at one scary moment, almost included Red. I was still doing the test riding, and when Elvis encouraged me to find a ride for myself, I found a big, friendly black horse. With all the barn renovations going on, there was room for plenty more horses, and since Elvis was in a buying mood, pretty soon the whole inner circle formed its own unofficial Graceland riding club. Billy and Joe Smith had horses, Alan and Joe Fortis were up on their mounts, and Richard Davis had his own horse too, but always got a laugh settling his lanky frame atop one of the little ponies the Colonel had sent to Elvis as a gift. The horses pulled us together in a very happy way, and it started to feel as if some of the fun and games and good times from the fairgrounds had been moved right to Graceland. Elvis proved to be the hardest rider to find the right horse for. The daredevil side of him wanted an animal that was the strongest and fastest of all. But he was still battling his nervousness about being back in the saddle and needed a very well-trained, dependable horse that wouldn't fight him. The first horse he bought for himself was easy to handle, but was too tame, so we went out looking for another. I guess word of all the horse-related purchases at Graceland spread pretty quickly, because one day when Elvis and I were out looking for horses, I was approached by a man named Robert Boyd, who said he had the perfect horse for Elvis. I was a little wary. In our short time as horse buyers, we had discovered that horse traders could be as snaky as used car salesmen. But Boyd got my attention by showing me a picture of a huge, beautiful horse with his 12-year-old daughter in the saddle, proudly wearing the blue ribbon sash she and the horse had just won. He told me that his daughter had ridden this particular horse in shows and equestrian events, and had never had any problems. The horse was strong, smart, and impeccably trained. Boyd said he was more interested in finding a great home for the horse than in making a big profit from a sale, and went on to say that just about anybody else who wanted to sell a horse to Elvis was going to rip him off. I pulled Elvis aside and showed him the picture. "Let's go," he said. The horse was a gorgeous golden palomino, just as powerful and well-trained as the man had said. Elvis was taken with it right away. He bought it on the spot and soon renamed it Rising Sun. The barn got renamed, too. When I pointed out to him that the structure was now the House of the Rising Sun, he liked the idea enough to paint House of Rising Sun on the side of the barn. It took Elvis a while to get comfortable as a rider, and it was interesting to watch him push himself. The first time he climbed up on Sun, he was clearly still uncomfortable, but he rode a little longer and a little harder every day, until after a couple of weeks he looked as natural in the saddle as he did behind the wheel of a Lincoln. I'd become comfortable with the horses pretty quickly, too, so I decided to push myself toward mastering an even scarier form of transportation. I was going to become an airplane pilot. Even aside from the Paramount shouting match, something had been bothering me for a while about the mix of my professional and personal life with Elvis. I was thrilled to be his friend, but it seemed awkward to think of that as a career. What exactly was my line of work? Something had clicked for me when I'd watched all those talented, qualified movie people around the sets, each contributing to the overall process as a master of their own craft. I guess it was a mix of Catholic guilt and Protestant work ethic, but I started to feel that if I was going to be on Elvis's payroll, I wanted to offer some clear, constructive service to him, like being his personal pilot. I'd be his friend for free. I began spending mornings over at the Memphis airport, taking some flight lessons from a guy who had done time as a fighter pilot over in Vietnam. He put me on an accelerated lesson plan, and after only 9 hours of instruction, he let me take my first solo flight piloting a little Cherokee 140. It was an easy takeoff. It seemed like all you had to do was give the plane some speed and you couldn't go wrong. But being alone for the first time up there, I became very aware of all the noises around me. The wind was roaring, and I started hearing all sorts of cracks and creaks from the plane, noises I wasn't sure I'd ever heard an aircraft make before. I tried to keep my rising nervousness in check and contacted the airport's control tower, identifying myself as a student pilot and requesting clearance for a touch-and-go landing. A voice from the tower asked me to repeat what I'd said, and I did. But when the voice answered back, what I heard was a crackle of static and maybe every fourth word the guy was saying. The radio wasn't working. I started to break a nervous sweat. I radioed in again and tried to make it clear that I was requesting a runway with no crosswinds. I hadn't yet been instructed on the tricky art of crosswind landings. Apparently the guy in the tower was hearing only every fourth word I was saying and thought I was asking for a place to practice my crosswind landings. I was directed to the runway with the strongest crosswinds on the field. I started to come in for my landing, but the powerful winds kept pushing the plane sideways, offline with the runway. The only way I could get the plane lined up again was to increase my speed, and when another gust blew me sideways, I had to go even faster. This during the time I was supposed to be slowing down to land the plane. But speeding up and slowing down became a moot point. My palms got so sweaty that I couldn't even keep my hands on the throttle. I hit the runway too hard, and the little plane bounced up into the air with a terrible groan. The wind hit me and blew the plane off the runway. When I hit the ground again, I was out on the grass of the airfield. I tried to steer the plane back to the runway, but as it dipped into the turn, the left wing caught the turf and the plane slammed propeller first into the ground. Suddenly things were a whole lot quieter, and I found I was upside down, strapped into my seat, listening to just two sounds, my heart pounding in my chest and the fuel pump clicking away. I guess the thought of imminent explosion focused my mind because I got myself unbuckled and out of the plane before the fire trucks and the airport police showed up. I don't remember leaving or driving back to Graceland. All I remember is getting to the barn, walking past Elvis, hopping on my horse, and going for a full gallop ride around the property. I needed an outlet for all that nervous energy, and I think I also needed to prove to myself that I could pilot something without crashing it. When I got back to the barn, Elvis looked at me hard and said, "What happened?" "What do you mean?" Jerry, when you got on that horse, you had the wildest eyes I've ever seen on a man. What happened?" I told him. "Jerry, forget about the airplanes. You're too young." "There are pilots younger than me, E." "Yeah, but I don't want a young pilot. Anything we run into up in the air, I don't want a pilot who hasn't dealt with it before. I'll stick with an old-timer. You know what I mean?" I did. I gave up the plane lessons for a while and stuck with the horses. As more horses joined the Graceland herd, more work needed to be done on the barn and on the fences. And when I think about favorite times with Elvis, this period always jumps to mind. Here was Elvis Presley, finding satisfaction in wiping cobwebs out of an old barn, in nailing up planks and painting fence posts. We'd spend hours together in the afternoon just going through all the basic chores of horse care, checking their water, forking over their hay, brushing out their coats. Sometimes, walking through the Graceland kitchen, I'd find a yellow legal pad on the counter with personal notes from Elvis making me aware of what job needed to be handled next. "We need to get 3 bridles. We need more horse blankets. We need stirrups to match the bridles," would be written out in red. Elvis wasn't a guy who usually left notes for anybody, but the last thing he'd do each night was write these out, so that every detail he thought of would get taken care of. After working all day, we'd often go back out to the freezing cold of the barn, bundled up in our jackets and cowboy hats. We'd sit around a little bucket of fire out there with our feet up, passing the time away. Sometimes Priscilla and Sandy, whose gift horses had started all this, were down there with us. One of them would make coffee, and we'd huddle together and sip from our mugs. Sometimes a few of the guys would hang out together down there, having a laugh. And sometimes it was just Elvis and me next to the fire, talking away like we had on that very first cross-country trip. Sure, I loved the limos and the mansions and the movie life and the VIP treatment everywhere we went. But this simple cowboy life was just as satisfying, and everything I loved about our friendship was right there in that freezing, freshly painted barn. I felt Elvis had created something great with the barn and the horses. He had given himself a perfect way to escape the pressures and burdens that built up on him outside of those stables. But it was just impossible for him to say, "This is just right." Instead, he must have felt that if having 10 horses was a good thing, having 20 would be even better, and having 30 would be even better than that. We kept going out and buying more animals and more gear, and our trips started happening during typical Elvis hours. We'd often be down in Mississippi somewhere, riding potential purchases at 3 in the morning. On one of those trips, Elvis and Priscilla, Sandy and I, and Alan Fortas went out, driving down to the renowned Lennox Farms in Mississippi to find a Tennessee Walker for Vernon. It was just about daybreak as we headed back toward Graceland, piled together in that big old double-cab pickup truck. Alan was driving, and all of a sudden, Elvis told him to pull off the road. When Alan did so, Elvis pointed out the passenger window. Right away, we all saw what he saw. A huge white cross towering over some rolling green hills as pristine as a golf course. The first rays of sunlight were glinting off a rippling lake in the center of the property, and there was one perfectly quaint little farmhouse close to the road. There was also a "For Sale" sign up. Elvis got that look in his eye, the one that meant he had just put a plan together. "Alan," he said, "go knock on the door of that house. Tell him you want to buy this place, but don't tell him it's for me." The place was called Twinkletown Farm, and was owned by Jack Adams, a retired TWA pilot who had made a fortune as a used aircraft salesman. Within days, it belonged to Elvis, and was promptly rechristened the Circle G Ranch. Elvis's plan of having Alan pose as the buyer didn't save much money, as Elvis agreed to Adams's asking price without even a pretense of negotiation. What had started as a humble, hands-on pleasure in back of Graceland had now become a massive, money-gobbling endeavor. And what had begun with such a sweet impulse to give a wonderful gift to Priscilla and Sandy turned into an almost unquenchable desire to accumulate. Within weeks, the 160-acre Circle G was home to 40 horses, along with trucks, tractors, trailers, and all sorts of expensive ranch gear. In addition, there were 100 head of Santa Gertrudis cattle that came with the price of the ranch. Elvis loved to take on a challenging project. He loved to spend money, and he loved to have the people he loved around him. The ranch gave him a chance to have all of that at once, and as things settled down a bit, there were some good times. Elvis was active and having fun, and Priscilla, Sandy, and I, along with Alan, Marty, Red, Larry Geller, Mike Keaton, Richard Davis, Joe and Joni Esposito, and Billy and Joe Smith, got into the spirit too, spending a lot of time on horseback. The horses were trained and looked after by Mike McGregor, a professional horseman and saddler who became a well-liked and much-appreciated member of the group, the Circle G's answer to the Marlboro Man. There were picnics, barbecues, target shooting, snake hunts, a lot of nice, easy-going, outdoorsy moments. I even got back up in a small plane. Jack Adams turned out to be a real friendly guy, a dignified gentleman with a warm, open manner. When he heard about my training and my crash, he took me out to Twinkletown Airport, about 5 minutes away from the ranch, and got me to agree to co-pilot a plane with him. He felt it was important that I get up in a plane again soon and get over the fear of what had happened. We had a nice, smooth flight, and I had no fear at all as long as Jack was piloting. When we landed, I was about to get out when Jack said, "You can do it solo now. You won't feel satisfied if you don't." I took the plane up, feeling a little nervous at first, but Jack had gone over things with me enough that my confidence started to come back. I made it back down, and this time managed to avoid any crosswinds, and, with some further encouragement from Jack, went on to log another 40 hours of solo flight time. For all the activity at the ranch, something about it didn't feel right to me. It just seemed like too much, too fast, with Elvis spending way too much money. I was perfectly content with those late-night talks in the old Graceland barn, but that wasn't enough to satisfy Elvis. He liked to do things big, but it seemed to me that things at the ranch had gotten so big that they weren't special anymore. I know Elvis's impulse to buy came from a heartfelt generosity. He wanted to buy so that he could share with the rest of us, but I could also see something desperate in all that buying. Part of Elvis's plan was to deed over an acre of ranch land to each of the guys. I think he wanted to create a sort of cowboy commune for all of us. At first, Vernon was very supportive of the idea, but I'm almost sure the Colonel got to him and soured him on the deal. The Colonel was not at all excited about the prospect of having Elvis regularly sequestered away on a Mississippi ranch, surrounded by his guys and well out of reach of the Colonel's influence. When Vernon steered his son away from handing out the land parcels, Elvis instead decided to buy a few house trailers so that there would always be accommodations for a few members of the inner circle to stay at the ranch with him and Priscilla. Elvis approached a few of us about buying these trailers. He'd arrange everything and put up the down payment, and then we'd take on the rest of the payments. He thought it was a great way for us to own a piece of his ranch. I had agonized over taking on payments for my own motorcycle, and I really didn't want to be putting money into a Mississippi house trailer. Elvis and I had some frank discussions over this, and he just couldn't understand why I wouldn't jump at the opportunity. Resistance didn't accomplish much. Elvis had already arranged for trailers to be leased and delivered. I put up the money and started making the payments. Some of the other guys did too. But as usual, Elvis ended up paying off everything. I put up some stronger resistance over the issue of a brand new truck. We had the horses, we had golf carts, we had some old trucks. There were plenty of ways to get around the ranch property. But Elvis, still in full spending spree, decided that everybody needed a brand new Ford Ranchero pickup truck. I think I was out doing some work on the house trailer I hadn't wanted when Elvis came by and tossed me some keys. "That's for your truck." The bigger the gift, the more casual he liked to act about it, so it took me a moment to understand what he was giving me. "Elvis, I don't want a truck. I don't need a truck." That was a reaction he hadn't expected, and it stopped him in his tracks. He looked a little puzzled, a little pissed. "It's your truck, man. Drive it." For the first time, receiving something from Elvis didn't feel special at all to me. He didn't care whether I wanted it or needed it. It didn't even matter that it was for me. He was handing them out to everybody. And the giving didn't seem to mean anything to him. When he had bought me and the guys our convertible Cadillacs, the act seemed so personal and loving that some of the guys got choked up over it. The feeling behind the gift meant so much more than the cars themselves. But this brand-new truck had no meaning at all, for Elvis or for me. He was just spending money. The motorcycles and the Cadillacs were extravagant gifts, but they had, in some way, pulled the guys together. Elvis's unlimited spending and gifting was now creating more pettiness among the guys. Somebody was always upset that so-and-so had the nicer trailer, the fancier saddle, or the better color truck. He could tell that the ranchero left me cold, but he barely reacted. He just walked toward an electrician who happened to be there that day, working on some of the power lines to the trailers. Elvis called out to this guy, a stranger to all of us. "Hey man, you want a new truck?" "Well, sure," said the electrician. "It's yours." The electrician got the keys. Elvis spent nearly $1 million over the space of a few weeks acquiring and gearing up that ranch. And actually, there was a very understandable explanation for all that spending. Just before we began our horse-buying spree, Elvis had been sent the script for his next film, Clambake, which had every indication of being his lousiest production yet. I know it just bothered the hell out of him. His music was being messed with, his once promising film career had been turned into a joke, and he didn't see any way out. He knew he wasn't looking his best. He had put on some weight over the last couple of months, and this time was having a hard time dropping it. The idea of turning a ranch into a refuge for himself had to be appealing. His spiritual readings and his LSD trip hadn't gotten him to the peaceful state of mind he was after. Maybe he could spend his way there at the Circle G. He really did not want to go back to Hollywood this time, and as the deadline for returning to L.A. for film work loomed, Elvis announced that he needed a postponement in the production schedule because he had ridden hard enough and long enough to develop some painful and incapacitating saddle sores. George Klein's girlfriend, Barbara, worked for a medical group and recommended a doctor from the group to come out to the ranch, examine Elvis, and provide prescription ointments for treatment. That doctor was George Nicopolis, who would soon be more familiarly known as Dr. Nick, and would become an integral member of Elvis's inner circle. Elvis's attempt at seclusion got the Colonel's attention. He was furious that Elvis was going incommunicado and messing with business as usual. He put a good deal of pressure on Marty Lacker to guarantee that Elvis would follow through on the schedule and responsibilities that his film contract demanded. Elvis Presley was not going to be able to escape being Elvis just by riding horses, and he knew it. The more he thought about what he would be leaving the ranch to go back to, the more it must have torn him apart inside. But when he took enough of some of the pills prescribed to him, he didn't have to think about anything at all. Late one night, Sandy and I were in our trailer, listening to a winter rainstorm pound away at the roof. At first I didn't realize there was a knocking at the door. When I answered it, there was Elvis, standing in the pouring rain, looking confused and disheveled, and holding, somewhat improbably, a loaf of bread. "Jerry, I need you to come with me." It was late, and I would have rather stayed in, but there was no way I could say no to Elvis when he was looking so vulnerable. I grabbed a coat, we got to his truck, and headed off the ranch. We headed all the way back up to the Memphis suburbs, and Elvis seemed to know exactly where he was going. He got to the neighborhood of South Haven, turned down a street, and pulled up in front of a modest home. He told me it was the home of the pharmacist we dealt with most often in Memphis. He was there for a personal pickup. I'd known for a while that Elvis was taking too much medication, but I had no idea he knew where our pharmacist lived. We'd all been using the prescribed uppers and downers to keep up with the lifestyle we were in, and there had been a few scary moments. Alan Fortis, who had refused to give me any sleeping pills when I started with the guys because he knew the damage they were doing to his system, spun out of control one night in L.A. and had to be taken to the emergency room. He became so violent with the doctors and nurses that it was up to Richard Davis and me to restrain him so he could be sedated. But Elvis always seemed to be in control. You didn't see him get sloppy or wild, and his usage always seemed tied to some work-related purpose, trying to keep his weight down or trying to get himself to sleep so he could be up for one of those 7 a.m. film set calls. He thought of his pills as helpful medicine. But seeing the state he was in on that rainy night and seeing how important getting a hold of some relief was to him, I became worried. Elvis gave everyone cause for concern when we got back out to L.A. One night at the Rocca Place house, Elvis fell in his bathroom and banged his head hard enough to give himself a concussion. It was pretty clear to everyone that the reason for the fall was not simply a loose electrical cord on the floor. Whatever Elvis was taking to try to blot out his frustrations was starting to have a clear negative effect on him. Doctors treated Elvis at the house, and a day later the Colonel came over for a short private meeting with Elvis, and then a group meeting with Elvis and all the guys. Despite the Colonel's stated policy of not getting involved in Elvis's personal life, when the personal interfered with the business, he stepped right in. At the group meeting, he took charge and ripped into us. Right off the bat, Marty Lacker was told that he would no longer be co-foreman with Joe Esposito. Joe was now solo top man. And it was made clear that anybody who insisted on getting Elvis's head all fogged up with talk of religion and spirituality would no longer be welcome. The Colonel's way of dismissing Larry Geller. He went on, making it sound like it was us guys who had been wasting Elvis's money, and making it clear that there would be cutbacks in payroll and expenses, and that several of us would be let go after the current film was finished. The most disturbing part of the meeting was that Elvis was sitting right there, looking down at the floor, letting the fat old man, as he so often referred to the Colonel, cut us down. There's no way this could have happened when Elvis was at full strength. Elvis truly needed the Colonel just then to make things right with the studio and get a messy situation under control. But the Colonel was also asserting himself in Elvis's personal life in a way he had never dared to before. It's one of the very few times I saw Elvis let the Colonel get away with that kind of power play, and it was depressing to watch. I went back to my room after the meeting and began packing my old suitcase again. I liked Larry Geller. I liked having discussions about spirituality with Elvis, and I knew I was seen as more of an independent spirit in the group. From what the Colonel had said, I assumed that I was one of the guys no longer wanted, and I wasn't going to hang around if that was the case. Then Elvis walked in, still looking dejected. He seemed a little surprised to see me packing again, but there was no hug this time. He simply shook his head and said, "He wasn't talking about you, man. He wasn't talking about you." In the midst of this strange and strained time, one thing was clearer than ever to me. I loved Sandy. We flew out to Las Vegas just a couple of days after that tense meeting with the Colonel and got married. I would have loved for Elvis to be my best man, but he was in Palm Springs, still recuperating from his concussion. He'd asked for a second postponement in the Clambake shooting schedule because of his fall, and it wouldn't have gone over well if he had turned up in Vegas. Sandy and I had a simple, low-key ceremony with Joe and Joni Esposito standing with us as best man and maid of honor, and we spent a weekend on the town as our honeymoon. Elvis paid for all of it as our wedding gift. Of course, the weekend was all about the celebration of love between Sandy and me, but it was also nice to share the occasion with Joe and Joni. Elvis had always been at the center of anything we did together, but here we were away from all that, and the time the four of us spent together felt very special. Back in L.A., we went to work on Clambake, which turned out to be just the kind of by-the-numbers production that Elvis now dreaded. Some of the guys tried to lighten the mood with some favorite on-set mischief, setting off firecrackers and tossing water balloons, but it started to look to me like we were a little old for balloon fights. And even though a well-timed firecracker might get a laugh, it was becoming harder to tell if people were actually having fun or just acting like they were having fun. On May 1, 1967, a few days after production had wrapped, Elvis and Priscilla became a married couple. It's understandable that Elvis's wedding would be treated with some secrecy. Nobody wanted it to turn into a circus. But on this most personal of days, the Colonel did not hesitate to run the show. His idea of a smooth event was one in which the guys were minimally involved. In fact, when the whole entourage finally got to the site of the wedding, the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, the Memphis Mafia found itself disinvited. The Colonel planned for Elvis and Priscilla's ceremony to be held in a hotel suite and announced that there was room for only Joe and Marty, doing their last co-foreman duty as co-best men, and George Klein, who had flown in from Memphis for the wedding. There was room for the Colonel's friend, Aladdin owner Milton Prell, a stranger to Elvis. But not for us. Myself, Red West, Alan Fortas, Richard Davis, and our wives were expected to turn up only at the reception. Larry Geller was not even invited to that. Red was angry and hurt enough to kick in the door to his room and simply skipped the whole thing, heading back to L.A. The rest of us were upset, but nobody wanted to do anything to spoil the day for the couple. Elvis, though, tried to make up for some of the hurt feelings by essentially inviting us along on his honeymoon. When he carried Priscilla across the threshold of their new Palm Springs home, the so-called honeymoon house, the first thing Priscilla saw on the other side of that threshold was us. Me and Sandy, Joe and Joni, and a couple of others. We were courteous enough to come in through a back door rather than trample the threshold before the newlyweds did. And after a day or two, when the beautiful couple headed off for their real honeymoon getaway, we were all right there with them at the Circle G Ranch. Maybe it was because the buying was all out of the way. Maybe it was because, having frightened himself with his fall, Elvis had gotten himself healthy again. Maybe the Colonel's coming down hard had made him more determined to take back life on his own terms. Maybe it was because he was just so much in love with Priscilla. But whatever the case, when we all went back to the ranch again, it really was a magical time. Elvis was calm and contented. Priscilla was thrilled to be away from Graceland or the big L.A. houses. She was happy to be in a simple place where she could cook breakfast for Elvis and make his coffee, happy to be an attentive wife for her loving husband. She and Elvis actually moved out of the ranch farmhouse, giving it to Alan Fortas and his wife Jo, so that Priscilla and Elvis could enjoy the closer intimacy of one of the house trailers. Sandy and I still had a honeymoon glow too, and we were thrilled to be in our little trailer. All the guys and wives were getting along with each other, and we really did start to feel like a big, happy family. A strange family, but a happy one. Somehow, after a false start, Elvis's dream of a cowboy commune seemed to be working perfectly. My daddy came down to spend a little time at the ranch, and I think one of the sights that Elvis enjoyed the most was my father up on a horse. We had all learned pretty quickly that the key to riding was to yield to the animal, to loosen up and let yourself move along with the horse. My daddy was never what you'd call a loose or yielding guy, and the sight of him sitting solemn and stiff-backed in the saddle, trying to maintain control of a Tennessee walker, had Elvis laughing hard. There were more cookouts and picnics and frog hunts and football games, and this time the vibe at the place was just right. The days were easy and lazy and fine, and I didn't get summoned for any more late-night trips to the pharmacist's house. Things went well enough that a month later, when it was time to head back to Los Angeles for another typical film, Speedway, Elvis made a very surprising decision. Instead of kissing wives and girlfriends goodbye and heading to work on the usual cross-country drive, this time we would keep the good times rolling with a family caravan to California. The Schillings, Espositos, Smiths, Lackers, and Gambles became a happy-go-lucky motoring tourist group, the only such group to include Elvis Presley as its bus driver. I don't remember anything especially dramatic happening during the production of Speedway, but by the end of the shoot, I had made one of the biggest decisions of my life. I was going to leave Elvis. Not in anger, and not really because of anything about Elvis at all. I was happy being one of Elvis's guys, but I was going to leave to answer a question that had been gnawing at me. Could I be something other than one of Elvis's guys? During the film production, I started spending a lot of time with Bill Saraceno, a top music editor at MGM. I remember being awed by the look of his workroom, with all the various reels of dialogue, sound effects, and music recordings spinning away, and I was greatly impressed with the skill and craft Bill applied to his work. I got excited by the mix of hands-on mechanics and artistic creativity that went into the film editing process. I also thought it might be nice to have a job that depended solely on my own skills, that wasn't tied to somebody else's moods or impulses. Finally, I figured that if I couldn't be Elvis's pilot, maybe I could be his film editor. I sat up with him at the Rocca House one night, beating around the bush enough that he realized something was up. "Jerry, what's on your mind? Just say it, man." I was nervous. If Elvis fired somebody, he might later change his mind and hire them back, but I'd never heard of anyone telling Elvis they were leaving him and staying in his good graces. With the premium he put on loyalty, it seemed like if you chose to step out of the circle, you'd be gone forever. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Elvis. I can't tell you how much, but I feel like I've got to do something else. I want to stay out here and work for myself." He nodded appreciatively. "I got it, Jerry. Tell me what you want to do. We'll make a call or something." "No, Elvis, it's all right. I've been talking to some guys at the studio. I think I'm going to take a shot at becoming a film editor." He nodded some more, slowly, staring out the window. "Film editor. It's a good move." No explosion, no ill will, nothing petty. It felt like maybe he was just a little sad that I wouldn't be around, and walking out of that room became the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. "Thanks for everything, Elvis. I really mean it." He didn't say anything. I knew he wanted me to stay, but as a friend, he wasn't going to stop me from doing what I felt I had to do. Life was suddenly a lot smaller and a lot harder, but not unpleasant. Sandy and I moved out of the Rocca Place house and into a small one-bedroom apartment in Culver City, a block away from MGM. I figured being close to a studio couldn't hurt my career transition. I didn't have any illusions that breaking into the editing profession would be easy, but I knew I was smart enough and hard-working enough to support us somehow. Sandy was entirely supportive of the move, and I think she was actually happier to be in a place, however humble, that we had to ourselves. A place away from the guy's world around Elvis. And I don't think either one of us really missed the luxuries of Bel Air. There was something very satisfying about stocking our own refrigerator, cooking our own meals, and paying our own phone bills. We would survive. I didn't have any doubts about that. The only doubt that nagged at me concerned Elvis. We had made it through fights and all kinds of friction, but I wondered if I could step away like this and still be considered his friend. He had built a world where his friends, the people he cared about, were close around him. If I wasn't right there with him, was I going to be a part of his life at all? A couple of weeks later, on a Friday evening, I hadn't made much progress in my editing career, but Sandy and I were starting to get very comfortable in our small apartment. The phone rang. "Jerry, you do that editing on the weekends?" "No, E. Actually, I haven't really started yet." "Okay, I'm coming by to pick you up. We're going to Palm Springs." The biggest fear of my life, losing Elvis's friendship, just disappeared as we spoke. I was still a guy he wanted to share a weekend with. An hour later he did come by, and with Sandy's very understanding blessing, Elvis and I were off to the desert. I had a loving wife, a wide-open job future, and a great friend. I could certainly live with that. Being a friend of Elvis didn't help me get a job as an editor. There were some strict union rules in that line of work that weren't going to bend for anybody. However, some of the friends I'd made on Elvis sets, first and second assistant directors, stunt coordinators, were willing to get me some gigs on other sets. I began a brief but exciting career as Jerry Schilling, actor. Over the next several months, I put together a list of credits that included extra work on Rat Patrol and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and photo double work on The Outcasts for actor Don Murray. probably best known for co-starring with Marilyn Monroe in Bus Stop. I was a two-faced alien on Star Trek, and a muscle-bound policeman on Get Smart. I got chewed out on that set by guest star Don Rickles when a karate chop I hit him with was a little too realistic for his tastes. He scared the hell out of me, but ended his tirade by flashing a big smile and letting me know that he was just putting me on. I began taking acting classes with Paul Manty at the Melrose Theater, and had the honor of sitting through a master class with Rod Steiger. Finally, some connections on the MGM lot, particularly through assistant director Claude Binion, got me a chance at a few speaking lines and some actual acting in Ice Station Zebra. It was on that set that I got a taste of everything Elvis had been missing in his films. I watched director John Sturges sit with his stars, Rock Hudson, Ernest Borgnine, Patrick McGowan, and discuss how a scene was going to work and how they'd approach it. Everyone took their roles seriously and obviously cared about doing great work. I realized what a raw deal Elvis had gotten, how often he was treated as if his talent didn't matter, and how often things were just rushed through on his set. I really enjoyed watching Rock Hudson work. He had that same kind of ease and natural talent as an actor that Elvis had as a performer. Rock had a powerful star presence, but he always came across as a regular guy, tough, funny, charming, and much more comfortable playing poker with the crew and the stunt guys than talking with the studio suits. Elvis looked great all the time, but he made sure he looked great. Rock looked great without doing anything, whether he was neatly put together in a Navy uniform or in jeans and a t-shirt with his hair messed up. He also loaned me his car so that I could get to the dentist to have a cracked tooth fixed. The acting job that meant the most to me in this period didn't offer me any lines or any chance to showcase my dramatic skills. In fact, it was a film that gave me only about a second and a half of screen time. It was called Stay Away Joe, the first film Elvis did after I set out on my own. He called me up to offer some work on the location shoot in Arizona and said he'd take care of everything. So I became one of the few struggling actors to have a limo and chartered plane at my disposal, and before long I was palling around with Elvis and Joe and Red and Sonny West. It meant a lot to have him reach out to me so that we could spend some time together out in the Arizona desert. As far as my friendship with these guys was concerned, it didn't feel like I'd lost a thing. In fact, I even found a way to push my new hoped-for film editing career forward. I'd had a hard time getting in the door at ABC Television, where I'd tried to sign on as an apprentice editor, but didn't have enough background in the field to justify their taking me on. So I decided to build up that background as much as I could. After a day's shoot on Stay Away Joe, I'd hang out with the director, Peter Tewksbury, and his editor, George Brooks, a couple of talented guys who were happy to let me watch their work process and to offer me a free tutorial on the tricks of their trade. The more I watched, the more I was hooked, and the more I felt that despite ABC's resistance, and despite the success I'd had earning a SAG day rate to menace Captain Kirk or tackle Don Rickles, editing was the right line of work for me. It seemed that stepping away as an employee of Elvis only brought us closer as friends. By December of 1967, Priscilla was 7 months pregnant. If you do the math, you can see how happy those honeymoon ranch times were. When she and Elvis decided to take a drive up the coast to visit her parents at Fort Ord, Sandy and I were invited along for the ride. Elvis wanted to tend to his expectant wife as much as possible, so I became the wheelman, driving a caddy limousine so that the four of us could ride in maximum comfort. The plan was to drive up around Monterey, spend the night in a motel, and then make it over to the nearby military base. On that drive, we took a very interesting side trip together. Elvis had decided to take advantage of an invitation that had been offered to him by George Stoll, the longtime genius conductor over at the MGM soundstage. He and his wife owned the Crocker Marble Palace on 17 Mile Drive near Pebble Beach and were very eager to have Elvis come by for a visit. We found the place just around the bend from the drive's famous landmark, the Witch Tree. That tree apparently set the tone for the palace. It was a damned spooky mansion. Spooky enough that the Stolls were having a hard time getting gardeners and housekeepers to work there. The woman doing the weeding out front turned out to be Mrs. Stoll. We were all a little creeped out by the place, but the Stolls were completely at home. They had fully embraced the spookiness and filled the place with macabre collectibles, such as 3 actual shrunken heads, which included what they proudly claimed was the only white shrunken head in North America. They also had an elaborate electric train set that ran between bedrooms, and a special stretching machine that George believed would counteract a loss of height due to nighttime shrinkage. Apart from the strange collectibles, the Stolls were wonderful hosts. George was a crazy, endearing mix of Toscanini, Einstein, and Hepcat, and nothing meant more to him than showing his guests a wonderful time. And part of that wonderful time included some energetic sampling of his extensive collection of aged bourbons. Elvis was not a drinker, and neither was I, but when you've got a bourbon enthusiast leading you through a tasting, pointing out the hints of wood and smoke and honey in the various blends, it's very difficult not to get excited about the stuff. I was hyper-conscious of the fact that I was the driver for a very pregnant woman, so I declined to partake of most of what was offered to me. But Elvis sampled just about everything he was offered, and enjoyed it too. After a while, we went out to have our dinner over at the posh, exclusive Pebble Beach Club restaurant, the 19th Hole. As we got to our table, all that bourbon tasting seemed to suddenly catch up with Elvis. He got groggy and very sleepy. He wanted to lie down on the restaurant floor for a quick rest, but after we discouraged that idea, he instead reclined on a couch against the wall. That turned out to be not such a great idea either. The restaurant management informed us that our behavior was unacceptable and that our business was no longer appreciated. I can say that I'm the guy who helped Elvis leave the fanciest joint he was ever thrown out of. The next day we finished our drive up the coast and made it over to the base to visit Colonel and Mrs. Bowyer, and Priscilla's 4 brothers and her sister Michelle. The Bowyers were friendly, generous people who clearly loved both Priscilla and Elvis a great deal. And it was interesting to see Elvis as a son-in-law. He was polite, charming, respectful, and seemed to be Colonel Bowyer's favorite audience for his ready supply of Air Force stories. Elvis also enjoyed getting into some esoteric conversations with Michelle, a 14-year-old free-spirited thinker who sported bright green nail polish. Elvis had become close with Speedway co-star Nancy Sinatra and wanted all of us to watch her NBC television special, Movin' with Nancy, which was airing that weekend. But he wanted to see the show in color, and the Bowyers' TV set was a black-and-white model, so when we went off to check into a nearby motel, he made some calls and ordered up a big color TV to be delivered as soon as possible to the Bowyers' address on the base. We headed back to their house just in time to see Colonel Bowyer, having no idea why a pair of deliverymen were trying to wheel a new television into his home, emphatically turning them away, insisting that there was some kind of mistake. Elvis straightened it all out, and we had a fine time together watching Nancy's special that night on the new set. The next day, Elvis had an idea for a road trip we could take with the Bowyers. He had me drive the limo back down to the Stolls' place so the Colonel and Mrs. could get a look at some of the collected oddities there. On second look, the castle was just as creepy, but the Stolls were again fun to be with, and it was a great day for everybody.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.